remained intact. Standing before him, one bare foot planted on a rocky mound, was the creature that had managed to keep him fighting for 10 straight minutes without a real break. A young female Wendigo. The legendary monster, or outcast, hard to classify, had a humanoid and beastly form. She was thin, bony, and small, with the body of a pre-adolescent girl, wrapped in tattered remnants and natural markings that resembled tribal tattoos. The Wendigo's skin was pale as bone, with a faint grayish tint. Her hair, pure white, fell in wild waves, tangled with branches, bones, and fragments of skulls. Her eyes glowed a fierce red, a murderous intensity similar to Zarvok's, but more beast-like and less malicious. Atop her head was a horned skull fused to her body, with natural horns sprouting from her true skull. Her smile was wide and twisted, a disturbing mix of childishness and predation. Wounds covered her entire body. Deep gashes ran across her ribs, and her face was streaked with dried blood and dirt. Zarvok was winning. The demon had greater strength, endurance, speed, and experience. Plus, he hadn't been weakened beforehand. Even so, the Wendigo didn't retreat. She stayed on her feet. She fought with a ferocity that didn't match her size or appearance. She had the body of a slender, small girl, but moved with the violence of something that had been caged for far too long. She was born imprisoned. Since she had gained consciousness, she had known nothing but a cage, injections, scalpels, white lights. The humans had kept her weak. But not anymore. She was finally free. And even though she was now facing this strange being, she couldn't help but feel exhilarated by her newfound freedom. Zarvok launched another attack, enjoying the hunt. He had never had the chance to encounter a Wendigo in such a state, not just young, but also weak and inexperienced. The Wendigo barely dodged, scraping the ground with her bare feet. She had no strategy, no plan. She simply threw everything she had into surviving. Zarvok swung his other free arm, and the girl could only raise her arms to shield herself. Bam! The Wendigo was sent flying, her arms breaking under the force of Zarvok's blow. She flew over 10 meters before crashing into a building, which collapsed entirely from the impact, burying her beneath the rubble. "Not bad, little one," Zarvok laughed, noticing that the arm he had struck her with bore a slight dent from the girl's fist. The Wendigo crawled out from the debris, breathing heavily, her body trembling as she rose, ready to continue the fight. Her chest heaved violently, but her eyes remained locked onto him, unwavering. She had been waiting for something like this for as long as she could remember. A battle. Her instincts screamed at her to keep fighting, to kill the creature, to feast on its flesh. Running wasn't an option. A few meters away, hidden among the ruins, Mortimer Spellman gritted his teeth. "Stupid demon, completely unreliable," he muttered under his breath, frowning deeply. Centralia was huge, the mines even more so. Without Zarvok's sense of smell, he had no way of tracking Luke. He was blind. He must be deep within this town, Mortimer thought, pulling a sealed grimoire from one of the hidden compartments inside his robe. He unrolled the magical clasp carefully, opened the book, and drove his staff into the earth. His other hand held the open tome. "Then seal off all the exits," he murmured, barely audible. And he began to read. The earth responded instantly. The very space itself started to tremble. A fissure opened in the air, not vertical, but slanted, floating about a meter above the ground. Dark inside, with edges of black and red energy. One by one, they began to emerge. 20 of them crawled out before the fissure closed. The bodies of the Morax were enormous, grotesque, and irregularly proportioned. 4 meters tall, with bright blue skin covered in a viscous layer that dripped as they entered this world. 2 small red orbs for eyes, driven purely by instinct and murderous intent. Their mouths were small but filled with razor-sharp teeth, enclosed by jaws that remained clamped shut until a target appeared. Their arms were long, ending in massive hands tipped with hardened claws. Their torsos moved like bellows with each breath. Their legs were thinner, ending in black claws that scraped against the rock as they walked. Mortimer spoke in an unintelligible tongue, and the Morax began to scatter across Centralia. At least they'll have some fun with those normies, he thought, knowing full well how difficult it was to control these creatures, even if they were just minor demons. Their killing instincts were too strong to expect them to stay still or systematically surround the area. The only upside was that they didn't fear death. Their hunger was far more powerful. If they caught a whiff of Luke, with his delicious psychic three-aura soul, they would throw themselves at him without hesitation, desperate to devour his essence. "What the hell are those things?" shouted one of the normie soldiers, opening fire with armor-piercing rounds as he retreated toward cover. The bullets either bounced off or barely sunk into the creature's viscous skin. "Demons," replied Jack Rourke from his higher position, his face covered in dust and dried blood, and I don't mean that as a metaphor. His voice was firm, but he couldn't hide the tension. Rourke's eyes stayed, locked on the 12 creatures, advancing toward them from different directions. The surveillance outpost was gone, reduced to rubble. It had been destroyed when Zarvok stormed through without warning. The massive creature, with its elongated head like a hardened mushroom and unmatched physical strength, tore through the reinforced walls as if they were paper. The underground scientific facility, where the Wendigo had been held, was the first to fall. The servers, the containment cells, the access tunnels, everything was destroyed. Many of their soldiers, staff, and scientists perished in the crossfire. Only a small group managed to escape: Rourke, Evelyn, Marcus, and 20 elite soldiers, all genetically enhanced. Along with them, a dozen scientists, non-combatants but valuable, were rescued and protected during the retreat. Now, they were cornered by the lesser demons. The Morax advanced without hesitation, their small red eyes gleaming, locked onto the normies like a pack of predators. Of course, none of them dared to steal Zarvok's prey, so they had to settle for this. "Defensive circle," Rourke shouted, barking orders. Evelyn, positioned higher up as a sniper, fired with surgical calm. Marcus stood on the front line, his body partially transformed, claws exposed, ready for the fight. 2 battles had erupted simultaneously. On one side, among the rubble and fractured structures, Zarvok and the Wendigo clashed with brutal force. On the other side, the Morax threw themselves relentlessly against the defensive perimeter. Crossfire was constant. The normie soldiers held their ground, but they were beginning to fall. One was caught by a claw. Another was crushed under the weight of a Morak that didn't even slow down despite being riddled with bullets. 3 dead in 30 seconds. If it weren't for Rourke, Evelyn, and Marcus, they would have been annihilated within the first moments. 4. 5. The line still held, but it was shrinking. "Hold your ground," Rourke shouted. "Don't break." The scientists, huddled at the center of the circle, watched the situation unfold with grim expressions and sweat beading on their foreheads. The chances of survival were looking slimmer by the second. At that very moment, the earth trembled. At first, it was subtle, a vibration running through the underground. Then, a low, muffled cracking sound traveled across the ground. Everyone felt it: Zarvok, the Wendigo, Mortimer, Rourke, Evelyn. Even the Morax paused for a second. And then the earth split open. A vertical fissure tore through the ghost town, running straight from the depths below to the surface, with a dry, deafening sound. It wasn't an explosion, it was a cut, clean, precise, and violent. A line of destruction carved itself into the terrain, splitting rocks, soil, ruins, and abandoned structures. Everything in its path was divided. The closest Morax were cleaved in half, without even realizing what had struck them. Burning gas, steam, and pressure burst forth in a violent column that rose dozens of meters into the air. And from the bottom of that fissure, something was ascending. Mortimer Spellman whipped around from his hiding place among the ruins, his eyes wide open. His staff slipped from his fingers, clattering against a stone. He said nothing, but his brow furrowed sharply. Zarvok halted his next charge. His claws were already inches from the Wendigo's face, but he didn't strike. Instead, he slowly turned, his eyes blazing. His sense of smell flared to life, and he muttered, "It came out of that hole." On the other side, Rurk, the soldiers, the hybrids, and the scientists stared in bewilderment, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They stood agape at the sight of the destruction, as if a giant scalpel had sliced the earth itself. And then they all saw it. A figure emerging from the fissure. It was Luke, his appearance immaculate, no dust, no dirt, nothing. In his right hand he held a clips, its runes now glowing and the blade still faintly vibrating with the remnants of the slash. A Morek lunged at Luke. It had caught his scent, and that was enough to drive it wild. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, stretching far beyond what it should, filled with razor-sharp, wet blades of teeth. His gaze wasn't one of rage, it was one of greed. It wanted to devour Luke's soul before its companions could steal it away. Luke glanced at it out of the corner of his eye. In a fraction of a second, he concentrated 50% of his telekinetic power into the blade of Eclipse. The process was instantaneous. Previously, condensing telekinetic waves of that magnitude onto his own arm had taken much longer. His attack to cut through mythical bronze had taken about 45 seconds. But now he had a real sword, a channeler designed for cutting. He made a single movement and slashed. The Morek was decapitated instantly. There was no resistance, not even a sound. Its head was cleanly severed from its body and tumbled through the air before crashing to the ground, skullless. Fatigue is minimal after 2 telekinetic cuts, 80% condensed in the first attack and nearly 50% in the second, Luke thought, analyzing his new strength. His training at the Adams Mansion had significantly increased his power, and now he was witnessing the fruits of that training. He had perfected the use of his 4 auras. And now, with the green aura active, his cellular regeneration, oxygenation, and physical efficiency were operating at maximum levels. Moreover, with Eclipse, not only was condensing his telekinesis faster, the slash was far more powerful. The metal of the blade was made of an alloy he didn't recognize, but he already understood its purpose. Durable, stable, a perfect structure for condensing his telekinesis. A few meters away, Rurk watched Luke. Then his gaze shifted to the Morek's decapitated body. The head had landed just 3 meters away from him. He killed it that fast, he couldn't help but think. The enhanced bullets fired by his soldiers barely scratched those demons. Some rounds even bounced off their skin entirely. To take down just 2 of them, several enhanced agents had died. And even then, they had only succeeded thanks to the direct support of Evelyn and Marcus, hybrids with genetic reinforcements and elite training. In contrast, Luke had sliced through the demon in a single move, without apparent effort. Not to mention, he had also opened a massive fissure stretching dozens of meters from God knows how far underground. Luke then turned his gaze toward the next group of Moraks nearby. They were lined up about 10 meters away from the normies. "Shambles," he murmured, and his body vanished instantly. The Moraks didn't even register the movement. A second later, Luke appeared right between them. Once again, he condensed telekinetic waves that hovered in a razor-thin layer around the blade, and he slashed. Another head was instantly severed. The Morek didn't even have time to react to Luke's teleportation technique and swift attack. Luke didn't stop. He slashed toward another Morek. However, this time, he didn't need to recondense his telekinesis. As long as he didn't release it, he could maintain the telekinetic waves constantly around the blade. He didn't have to discharge the energy in a single burst. Now he could sustain it. And in this kind of battle, it was far better. Not having to constantly condense waves into Eclipse allowed for faster, continuous attacks. He moved forward, spun, and delivered a diagonal slash. 2 more Moraks fell, one cleaved from shoulder to hip, and another with its head sliced cleanly in half. After 3 Morex dropped, the others finally reacted. The remaining 7 lunged at him simultaneously, their massive bodies charging like a coordinated swarm, driven by instinct. They sought to crush him through sheer brute force. Luke lowered his center of gravity and gripped Eclipse's hilt with both hands. He rotated his body into a full spin. A spinning slash, and this time he released the energy. The telekinetic waves surrounding the blade burst outward in a circular sweep. Just as the 7 Morax were mere meters away, mid-leap toward Luke, the sweeping slash struck them. They were severed instantly. Torsos divided. Heads rolled. Limbs were cut with absolute precision. They died before even hitting the ground. Luke came to a dead stop and calmly observed the demons, each one cleanly sliced apart. Back during the incident at Petropolis Manor, it had taken him far longer to kill these kinds of demons. And even though it hadn't been particularly difficult back then, now he achieved it much faster and far more brutally. He had just killed more than 10 of them in under 30 seconds. Luke stared at the bodies. It's not enough, he thought, feeling no satisfaction from the victory. The power was there, but he still felt the hollow ache left by Edgar's farewell. He needed an opponent who could withstand more blows. He slowly turned his head. About 20 meters away, behind some debris, an old man in a robe was staring back at him. Mortimer looked at Luke and couldn't help but feel a flicker of surprise at the boy's gaze, the boy who had come to hunt. Why did it feel like he was the prey? And in that instant, Luke vanished. Luke used shambles and appeared just 1 meter away from Mortimer. There was no sound, just an abrupt shift in space. The old man barely had time to open his eyes and take a step back, but it was already too late. Luke had already unleashed the slash. He moved Eclipse in a straight line, as if executing a clean cut through the air. The runes on the blade glowed briefly. Condensed telekinetic energy, 10 tons, was projected forward. A visible, razor-sharp wave sliced through the air at high speed toward Mortimer. Teesh, Mortimer clicked his tongue, reacting as fast as he could. His instinct saved him from being killed on the spot. Raising both hands, he formed a telekinetic shield with 35 tons of resistance. He couldn't summon his most powerful shield. This was the best he could muster in under a second. The shield appeared as a transparent, tense dome, curved and formed just inches in front of his body. Just enough to intercept the slash. However, the shield was not enough. Luke's slash hit with full force. Eclipse was a conduit of absolute precision. A relic designed to channel telekinetic force perfectly, with no dispersion or loss. Mortimer had formed a telekinetic shield with roughly 35 tons of raw resistance. Luke had unleashed a 10-ton slash. Mathematically, it seemed unbalanced. The shield had over triple the force. But the problem was something else. This wasn't a battle of strength versus strength. It was a matter of energy concentration. Luke had condensed 10 tons into an extremely thin and controlled edge. A projected slash, not as a wide impact, but as a blade of pure pressure. And in physics, concentrating force into a tiny area, the sharp edge of the slash, massively increases pressure. Mortimer's shield absorbed part of the blow, yes. It slowed it, reduced its final strength, but the pressure was too high. The shield lasted barely a second. After that, it cracked like glass under direct puncture. It didn't explode. It split, and the slash, though weakened, passed through. The remaining energy wasn't full, but still had enough power. At the last second, Mortimer managed to create a telekinetic burst to push himself away, but his arm was grazed by the slash. It wasn't severed, but a deep, clean wound was left behind. Mortimer immediately retreated, launching himself backward with telekinesis, clutching the wound with gritted teeth. That sword, Mortimer muttered through clenched teeth, eyes fixed on Luke, the Poe's sole weapon. His expression darkened. He had thought killing Luke would be easy. He knew Luke had 3 auras. That alone was exceptional. But even with that combination, Mortimer had assessed him as a manageable target. He estimated Luke's telekinetic strength at 10 tons, maybe 20 at most. He, on the other hand, could handle over 70 tons. He had even brought a mid-level demon with him, in case Luke tried to escape. Everything pointed to a swift victory. And yet, in their very first clash, he had been wounded. He hadn't imagined Luke possessed the Poe soul weapon, the same weapon that had killed Elliot's father, an artifact whose attacks were deadly. As for the battle between Luke and Elliot, no one believed Luke had killed Elliot. The credit was given to Fester and Gomez. Luke, instead, was praised for surviving, an admirable feat, but he had ended up in a coma for over a week. That's why he didn't attend the trial that marked the fall of the Spellmans and the start of the war. Thus, Mortimer and the other high-ranking members of the Spellman family did not consider Luke a serious threat. Only he, along with the demon capable of tracking Luke by scent, had been sent here. "What's wrong, Mortimer?" said Luke with a slight mocking smile, resting a clips on his shoulder. "You looked like you came here to kill me, but now you're scared." He walked forward calmly, as if strolling through a school hallway, not a battlefield. Mind reading, Mortimer thought, frowning, blood still dripping from his wounded arm. "Shut up, brat, that arrogance. It's exactly what will get you killed," Mortimer growled, raising his staff. "Every second you talk is precious time you're wasting." After saying this, he extended the staff forward, and the ground trembled. 70 tons of compressed force surged forward in a vortex, dragging with it chunks of concrete, twisted steel, and scalding vapor toward Luke. A frontal, brutal onslaught with a velocity Mortimer believed impossible for Luke to dodge, given the distance and the full force put into the strike. However, Luke had already activated his future vision and had seen the attack coming, allowing him to react. A second before the strike began, his expression changed and he moved, shambles. And just as he vanished, the attack struck his previous location, obliterating everything in its path. Mortimer's attack didn't just carry immense destructive power, its speed was extreme. Had Luke not used his future vision, dodging it would have been impossible. Luke reappeared just a few meters away from Mortimer. Eclipse was already charged. Telekinetic waves began to flow once more along the blade. The spatial shift was minimal, but Mortimer felt it, a subtle disturbance in air pressure. He turned instantly. His reflexes were far sharper than Luke had expected. Mortimer acted without hesitation. "Die!" he roared, channeling his entire telekinetic force onto the spot where Luke had just appeared. 70 tons of pure pressure. Not like a strike, but like a downward force, direct and brutal. Absolute crushing. Anything caught in that spot would be turned into an unrecognizable mass. And so it happened. Luke's body was crushed by the invisible force, collapsing in on itself as if a mountain had fallen on him. Mortimer lowered his staff, exhaling violently, his breathing ragged. "Heth, that's the end of you, brat," muttered with a faint smile. But no, that wasn't the end. The body began to fall apart. Not into blood, but into crows. A black swarm burst from the point of impact, flying in erratic directions, feathers scattering with sharp, dry sounds. "What?" Mortimer muttered, frozen in place. It had been an illusion. A mental projection that had altered all his senses. Sight, sound, even his energy field. Luke hadn't just manipulated his perception. He had left Eclipse, stabbed into the exact spot of the illusion, which had further convinced Mortimer of its authenticity. It was too late for Mortimer to react. Luke was already behind him. Before Mortimer could turn his head, he felt 2 firm hands grip his arms, one on each side. Without hesitation, Luke pulled with force. His body, trained for months under the green aura, possessed 2 tons of raw strength. Both arms tore from Mortimer's shoulders with a brutal, dry snap. Mortimer dropped to his knees with a hoarse, guttural scream. Blood gushed from his empty shoulders, soaking his black robes in scarlet within seconds. And yet he reacted, one final, desperate action. With a scream of rage, Mortimer activated his telekinesis. Not from his arms, they were gone, but directly from his mind. A brutal wave of energy was unleashed backward, aimed straight at Luke, who was still behind him. Even weakened, with his body collapsing and his aura trembling, he was still capable of moving several tons with that burst. Enough to crush anyone, or launch them into the air like a rag doll. But once again, Luke was no longer there. He had vanished again. Once more, Mortimer sensed the shift in space before he could understand it. The air grew denser to his left. And when he turned, his face twisted in pain, he saw him. Luke was standing beside Eclipse, pulling it from the ground, and then he looked at him. A look without urgency, without contempt, one that made Mortimer shudder. "This is the first time I've fought a telekinetic to the death. I have to say, it was a good fight, even if it didn't last long. That last shield of yours must have been over 30 tons, right?" said Luke, as if talking about a friendly sparring session. He spoke as if they weren't in the middle of a battlefield. As if Mortimer weren't bleeding out on his knees before him. Mortimer could barely breathe. The pain was constant, overwhelming. Blood soaked his robes and the ground around him. Although fighting Elliot and killing him was way more exciting, Luke added, now looking at Mortimer with a sneer of disdain. "What? You?" Mortimer murmured in shock, but before he could say anything or even attempt another futile counterattack, Luke snapped his fingers. The dry sound echoed near the old man. And the mental pain induction was activated. Thousands of invisible needles pierced Mortimer's mind in an instant, shredding his thoughts, crushing his senses. They didn't make him bleed. There were no visible wounds. Only unbearable pain, indescribable agony, as if his very soul were being torn out from inside his skull. Mortimer screamed, or tried to, but only a strangled gasp left his throat. Luke stepped one pace closer and snapped his fingers again. The mental assault repeated. Mortimer's mind shattered once more. The old man's eyes began to roll back. First, his eyes lost focus, then they turned dull. His thoughts stopped being thoughts. They became fragmented reflexes, disjointed images, aimless impulses. He no longer knew where he was, nor what his purpose was. Luke snapped his fingers again. A third time, and that was it. Mortimer didn't react anymore. His body collapsed forward, falling to his knees. Then, with a burst of telekinesis, Luke crushed the old man's body into pulp. As for Mortimer's staff, Luke decided to keep it. He might sell it, or it could be useful for something. Good, only the demon remains, Luke thought, now with a new target to bring down. "That old man is dead," Zarvok muttered to himself. Barely 5 minutes had passed since Luke had emerged from the depths of Centralia. He, on the other hand, was still enjoying his fight with the Wendigo. The creature, still in its juvenile stage, was putting up more resistance than he had anticipated. It wasn't due to strength or form, it was pure instinct and rage. Zarvok relished that. Before devouring a valuable soul, he always preferred to warm up the body. A defeated enemy, stripped of all hope, always tasted better. But Mortimer falling so quickly, that wasn't part of his plan. From the sky, just over 20 meters up, Luke was watching. He floated calmly, suspended above the battlefield, eclipse in hand. His expression was neutral and serene. His eyes followed every movement of the demon and the female humanoid monster. He knew it was a Wendigo. He had read about them in a Nevermore monster textbook. Thanks to his eidetic memory, recalling it was easy. Then Luke spoke. "Aren't you going to run?" he asked. His voice carried clearly, no need to shout. Zarvok glanced up briefly, smiling with fangs exposed. "And why would I run when I have 2 delicious meals in front of me?" he replied. He twisted his neck with an inhuman crack, momentarily taking his eyes off the Wendigo. A spark of greed ignited in his red pupils as he looked at Luke. "Your soul, psychic. It feels exquisite even from here." Luke didn't respond immediately. He just looked down for a moment, thoughtful, as if evaluating something. This is the first time I speak to a demon. You must be mid-class, since you have intelligence. Not like those Moreks, Luke said aloud, though more to himself than to Zarvok. He paused briefly, and then added with a scornful smile, though your intelligence doesn't seem that impressive. Your greed blinds you to the fact that you're screwed. Zarvok, who had been charging at the Wendigo, halted abruptly. His smile vanished, and he looked toward Luke. Screwed, he repeated, his tone no longer mocking, lower, darker. The Wendigo didn't use the moment to strike. Instead, it seized the chance to recover energy. It was at its limit. Its eyes flicked to Luke, and for a moment, beyond rage and instinct, it recognized something: danger. It didn't express it, but within its wild mind the thought was clear. He is more dangerous than Mushroom Head. It didn't know why, couldn't rationalize it, but it felt it, and it knew facing him meant certain death. You look young and arrogant, typical of your kind when you don't understand what you're dealing with, said Zarvok, his tone threatening, genuinely debating whether to abandon the Wendigo and go straight for Luke. Hunger clouds his judgment, better for me, thought Luke. Zarvok, like most demons of his class, had one defining flaw: greed. And Luke was far too tempting a meal. I don't understand what I'm dealing with, Luke repeated with a slight smile. You're a mortal creature, hungry for souls or whatever. You cross into this world to hunt, but when you feel threatened, you crawl back into your hole. The problem for you is that your hunger already clouded your judgment, Luke added, and released Eclipse. The sword didn't fall, it hovered in the air. Floating with precision, the blade pointed directly at Zarvok. Luke gave a small nod and launched it. The force was instant. Over 10 tons of telekinetic pressure behind a sword weighing maybe 3 kilograms. Eclipse shot forward like a spear of pure force, accelerating to a speed that sliced the air with a high-pitched whistle. Over 1,200 meters per second. Faster than any conventional projectile. Zarvok had no time to think, only to react on instinct. He twisted his torso, turned his body, and dodged it by centimeters. The blade passed by him, slicing through the air less than a hand's width from his neck. A stream of hot air struck him. The pressure from Eclipse's flight left a trail of flames in its wake. The sword kept going, tearing through a slab and shattering a column dozens of meters behind him. Luke gave a slight nod. He had seen what he wanted to see: resilience, reflexes, reaction time. Not bad for a creature driven by hunger. He had managed to dodge a supersonic strike using only his body, no psychic powers, no special abilities, just raw physical strength, muscle, and instinct. Using his enhanced mind, boosted by the blue aura, Luke was already calculating. Based on the weight, acceleration, and trajectory, Zarvok had moved over 40 tons of pure force in a fraction of a second. A body weighing nearly 500 kilograms, displaced laterally at nearly 1,000 meters per second squared. The kind of momentum that shattered walls, crushed armor, opened craters with a single leap. His physical strength had to be, easily, around 40 tons. A monstrous number. Not the highest Luke had ever seen, of course. Stalin, that old bastard who trained him at the Adams Manor, was even stronger, a monster among men. But Zarvok was still part of the physical elite. Luke knew that. If he only had telekinesis, he'd be screwed. With a maximum output of 15 tons, he couldn't pin him down. He couldn't throw him. He could only fly and keep his distance, play defense. But if the demon leapt and grabbed him, reacting in time would be nearly impossible, and his telekinetic shield would barely hold for a second, in the best of cases. That's why, if he had just one aura, he'd lose. But he didn't have one. He had 4. And on top of that, Eclipse. A sword that, even if it only channeled 15 tons, concentrated all that force into a single point. With such precision it could slice through anything, even bodies harder than steel, when enhanced by his telekinesis. That's why he wasn't worried. Luke calmly stretched out his hand. Eclipse floated back to him. The blade vibrated in the air, wrapped in an invisible halo of telekinetic pressure, ready to be launched again, but this time it wouldn't go alone. A second Eclipse appeared beside it. It wasn't real. It was a perfect illusion, shaped directly within Zarvok's perception. A mental manipulation that altered the senses, not just sight, but also weight, aura, even the sound it made slicing through the air. The two blades began spinning rapidly around Zarvok, tracing fast, tight, erratic orbits. A chaotic dance. Zarvok stepped back, not out of fear, but to improve his peripheral vision. He couldn't distinguish them visually, but he didn't need to. He sniffed. From above, Luke made a small motion with his index finger, and finally, one of the swords shot straight toward Zarvok's chest. Zarvok stood still, not dodging. The blade passed through him without harm. It was nothing but air. A second later, the real sword arrived. Zarvok managed to avoid the strike by mere centimeters, but the blade still grazed his left arm, carving a deep, clean line across his bicep. Zarvok growled through clenched teeth as dark blood poured from the wound. From the sky, Luke's voice came down like an emotionless sentence. "Good knows, I didn't think you could distinguish a weapon by its essence." "Well, it is a soul weapon, hard to replicate its essence with an illusion. Even Mortimer might have noticed the difference," Luke thought, not giving it much weight. It had just been a tactic he tested. Zarvok looked up at Luke. Eclipse was already floating again. And he understood, this sword was far too dangerous to let it act freely. He had to kill Luke, the true threat, before dealing with the Wendigo. Without a word or warning, Zarvok jumped. The ground exploded beneath him. Chunks of stone burst outward, the earth caved in, and his body launched toward the sky like a missile. He moved at over 40 meters per second, straight at Luke, leaving him almost no time to react. In less than half a second, the demon was upon him. Luke saw him coming, knowing he had less than a second to react. Most psychics would have been dead. But he wasn't looking at the present. He was seeing the future. The charge wasn't a surprise. It was a predicted point. And just before impact, he vanished using shambles. Space distorted, and Zarvok flew past with claws outstretched, slashing only air. His eyes flared with restrained fury, but he had no time to curse. Eclipse was already flying toward him. And this time, in such an awkward position, he couldn't dodge the supersonic blade. Eclipse pierced through the demon's right arm with surgical precision. The limbs spun through the air like dead weight. Zarvok roared, but Luke wasn't done. With his arm extended, above his index and middle fingers, he generated a telekinetic orb, compressing tons of telekinetic waves into a translucent, vibrating sphere. Without hesitation, he launched it from a blind spot toward Zarvok, who was falling unbalanced, missing an arm, unable to dodge. The orb struck the demon's back and exploded. An invisible shockwave burst out in every direction from the point of impact, as if gravity itself had collapsed. The air warped, Zarvok's flesh cracked, and his internal bones vibrated like crystal. Zarvok was hurled downward like a stone at terminal velocity, but he was no longer in control of his fall. The impact folded him midair, his body twisted unnaturally, then crashed into the ground with brutal force. The earth trembled on landing. A 3-meter crater opened beneath the demon's body. Rocks flew, burning fragments of Centralia spiraled upward. The impact made the ruins of the abandoned town rumble, as if something had detonated underground. Zarvok remained kneeling at the center of the crater. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. He had lost an arm, his entire body ached, bones were fractured from within, and his internal structure was damaged. A 3-aura user, Zarvok thought, coughing up black blood. Now he understood the fear surrounding psychics, who possessed more than one aura. He had never encountered one with 3. He knew he couldn't continue this battle. He understood, not out of fear but instinct. Now he understood why the brat had asked if he wasn't going to flee. He clenched his teeth and extended his left claw. Demonic energy began to twist and coil around him. The portal was about to open, his escape route, but then a strange voice echoed in his mind. Stop. It wasn't a suggestion or a warning. It was a command. Zarvok froze for a split second, just long enough for the barely formed portal to collapse in on itself and vanish. And in that exact moment, he heard a slicing sound, a clean stroke cutting through the air. Zarvok knew that sound. His expression darkened and horror overtook him. He recognized it. It was that cursed sword, but it was already too late. His wounds, his position, and the absurd speed of the sword. All of it made it impossible to even lift his head to see the weapon that would kill him. Eclipse, wrapped in telekinetic waves, slashed downward in a vertical arc. It struck Zarvok's skull and sliced down to his abdomen. A perfect line. Zarvok couldn't even scream. He was simply split without even enough time to feel pain. The flesh parted in silence. Dark blood spilled out without force. And the demon's body fell, split into two nearly perfect halves, into the crater. I told you to run, but you didn't listen, said Luke, shaking his head as he peered down into the crater, looking at the lifeless demon's body. Eclipse floated beside him, hovering at his back. And of course you tried to run. Classic demon, Luke muttered. Though it was his first time facing a demon with true intelligence, he had known the demon would try to escape the moment he felt truly threatened. That's why he had been prepared. A simple command, to shut down whatever portal or method he used to return to his dimension. I hope the body still holds some value, both economic and for research, Luke thought, as he began levitating Zarvok's remains out of the crater. He'd bring it as a gift for Wednesday. He was sure she'd love having an intermediate demon for her collection and personal study. And maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't scold him. Though she'll probably scold me anyway, Luke thought with a sigh. He hadn't kept his promise. He hadn't destroyed Gomez and Fester's teleportation stones. And she had asked him, made him promise, and still, he broke his word. Worse than that, Wednesday had spoken to him with emotion, with a sincerity she rarely let slip. Shit, Luke thought, scratching his head. He had gotten carried away by his emotions when saying goodbye to Edgar for good, and he'd wanted a punching bag. That's why he didn't break the stones. He looked at the demon's body, floating in front of him. Zarvok had been a real threat. An intelligent, savage, and powerful demon. Thanks to his arsenal of skills, his methodically trained auras and eclipse, he had secured this clean, almost easy victory. In the past, he would have died, or it would have been a brutal fight. And yet, this demon didn't scare him half as much as an angry Wednesday. Should I run? Luke wondered. Not Mortimer, not Zarvok, not even an army of Morax made him feel such dread as his girlfriend, arms crossed, looking at him and speaking in that icy tone. I just have to be brave and face her, Luke told himself, without much conviction. He sighed and looked away. Then he saw her. A few meters away, still standing, the Wendigo. A young creature, small, thin, ragged body, pale skin, horns seemingly fused into a fractured skull, red eyes glowing with rage and fear. Luke studied her carefully. He knew what she was. An exceptional specimen, rarer than a hide, fewer in number even than psychics. A living Wendigo, young, and most surprisingly, stable, with consciousness and reason. A thought crossed his mind. Wednesday would love to have a specimen like this, to study, dissect, or whatever else she wanted to do. She'd have both an intermediate demon and a unique Wendigo. Who else could boast such specimens in their lab? They'd be worth millions. Luke looked at the savage-looking girl with the same calm with which someone might evaluate a museum piece or a taxidermy display. The Wendigo trembled under Luke's gaze, wondering if this person would attack. If he did, her chance of survival was 0, and she knew it. I can't do it. I have principles, Luke muttered to himself, turning his gaze away from the Wendigo. He wasn't going to kidnap a lowly. She already looked like she'd suffered enough at the hands of the normies. It wasn't hard to tell she'd been kept as a test subject or something similar. Maybe it had something to do with the fight Edgar mentioned, the one between outcasts that left Centralia in this state. Luke looked toward the sky and bent his knees slightly, ready for takeoff. And then he heard it. A strange, rough sound. Wait. Luke stopped dead in his tracks and turned his head. The Wendigo was staring at him, and it seemed like she was the one who had called out. Though her voice was far too rough to belong to a girl who looked about 11 or 12. Luke raised an eyebrow, curious. You can talk. The Wendigo took a moment to answer. Her lips moved awkwardly, as if each word were a stiff, unused muscle refusing to cooperate. Why, yes, I learned, by listening to the men who kept me locked up, she said. She spoke slowly, like someone who had only recently learned the language and was still far from mastering it. Luke tilted his head slightly. First time you talk. With someone, yes, this is the first conversation, the girl replied, nodding. Luke stayed quiet for a few seconds, not because he found it strange for a girl to speak, but because of what it meant. From what he'd read in texts, Wendigos, or at least most of them, weren't supposed to be this rational. That was why they were hard to categorize. Outcasts, monsters, something in between. Most lost all logical thought. They gave in to hunger, to rage, to instinct. They weren't demons, since they didn't feed on souls or come from another dimension. But they also weren't outcasts like psychics or vampires, beings fully aware and in control of their actions. They were beasts, but not animals either. They were what people imagined when they thought of the word monster, like hides, but more extreme and powerful. And unlike normal wild animals, if you ran into a fully formed adult Wendigo in the woods at night, you could literally die of a heart attack just from the sight. Their strength was immense. Even this Wendigo, who barely looked like a preteen girl, had survived a fight with Zarvok. An intermediate demon with over 40 tons of physical strength, monstrous speed, and reflexes. And yet she had endured. She was weak, inexperienced, altered by years of captivity, mutilation, and normie chemicals, but still she stood. Her base strength must be high, Luke thought, a bit intrigued. He watched her for a moment longer, not lowering his guard completely. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice neutral, neither threatening nor openly interested. The Wendigo hesitated. Her lips moved like speaking was a painful effort. I go with you, she said at last, slow, clumsy, but clear in her intent. She pointed at herself, then at Luke. Luke raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the request. Go with me, he thought, tilting his head as he studied her. It didn't feel like a trap. He sensed no hostile intent, but still, it wasn't what he had expected. Why? He asked after a few seconds. The Wendigo looked down briefly, then shrugged, like she didn't know how to explain something that abstract. Or maybe she simply didn't yet have the words. Luke frowned slightly. Was he suspicious? Maybe. After all, it's not every day a half-feral creature strong enough to stand against an intermediate demon suddenly chooses to follow you of its own free will. And yet, could be useful, Luke thought. The Wendigo's strength was real. Despite being weak and likely suffering the effects of years of captivity, she had withstood Zarvok. And not just survived, she stood her ground. Not many could achieve such a feat. And beyond that, her rarity made her even more valuable. Wednesday would definitely be interested in seeing her, but not to experiment on her. Though on the outside she looked like a gothic psychopath who might dissect someone out of curiosity, her moral compass was solid, firmer, in fact, than that of many who claimed to be righteous. Wednesday didn't play with innocent lives. Maybe, if they were lucky, Wednesday would help her. Or at the very least, she'd observe her with that scientific fascination of hers, the same way a cat stares at something shiny for days. Luke sighed. "All right," he said finally, crossing his arms. The Wendigo looked at him and gave a faint smile, a mix of childlike and predatory, which for some reason was strangely unsettling. "But first, I need to inspect your body," Luke added calmly. The Wendigo girl didn't reply. She didn't back away either. She simply lowered her head slightly, giving him permission. Luke raised his right hand and gently placed it on her head. It felt similar to a normal human's, though bonier and slightly warmer than expected. She wasn't much taller than an average child. So the gesture looked almost brotherly, but there was no tenderness in his gaze. Luke activated his clairvoyance. Like a mental scanner, he perceived layers of muscle and metal. Normie devices, tiny ones embedded under the skin. Trackers, control nodes, even a small mechanism near each ear. Microinjectors, likely designed to release a paralytic or destructive chemical if she lost control. Luke frowned. He raised his other hand. Using his telekinetic control, he delicately extracted each of those devices. They slid out smoothly, causing minimal damage. The Wendigo didn't flinch. She knew he wouldn't hurt her. She could feel it. Her instincts didn't lie. Once Luke had gathered all the devices, he held them floating in front of him. A second later, they exploded into a cloud of metallic shards and sparks. Then his hand began to glow, softly, with a faint, soothing green light. He ran his palm over the spots where the devices had been, then over the deeper wounds left by Zarvok, and healed them. The flesh closed with an unnatural speed. Even for a creature with its own regenerative abilities, the process was accelerated. There was no pain, only a warm sensation, like warm water after a storm. "All done," Luke murmured, taking a step back. The Wendigo looked at him, briefly touching one of the spots where she had been injured. She wasn't smiling this time, but her expression had changed. Less feral, with a glimmer of hope. Luke took another step back and raised a hand. A translucent sphere of energy formed in front of him, floating about 1/2 a meter from his chest. "This shield can withstand 15 tons of force. Hit it with everything you've got," he said, looking at the Wendigo. The Wendigo tilted her head with an animal-like gesture, hesitating for a second. Then she nodded. She knew he wouldn't be hurt. She had watched him during the fight. If the shield broke, he could dodge easily. It was his way of testing her. She understood that in her own way. She tensed her muscles, bent her legs like a coiled spring, and lunged with her full body weight. A direct punch. Solid. Almost soundless. The shield shattered instantly. It didn't explode or ricochet. It cracked at its center and collapsed like a glass orb crushed by an invisible press. Luke analyzed the impact in his mind. She broke it too fast for a 15-ton barrier. Must be around 20, he thought, with a mix of restrained awe and growing curiosity. That explained why she had managed to hold her own against Zarvok, though she shouldn't have. Zarvok had double the strength, along with more speed, experience, and endurance. He could have killed her quickly, but he didn't. The most logical explanation was that the demon wanted to toy with her. Even so, 20 tons of actual physical force was monstrous, far above an average Hyde, and certainly beyond Tyler, the hybrid Hyde. Especially considering her age, health condition, and the toll she'd endured. Still, she couldn't be that young. Despite having the proportions of a 12-year-old girl, she must be older. The Centralia incident had occurred decades ago, and everything pointed to this Wendigo having been in normie hands since then. Which meant she could easily be 50 years old. And yet, she still looked like a child. Of course, Wendigos didn't age like normal humans. If a psychic could live up to 150 years if long-lived, Wendigos, according to records, could live around 500. Their developmental stages were different, much longer. And yet, their cognitive and emotional maturity was equivalent to that of a marginalized being like a psychic. Luke crouched slightly, placing a hand on the Wendigo's head. She looked up at him with intense, curious eyes. "Don't resist, just let go," he said calmly. She blinked once, then nodded. Telekinesis wrapped around their bodies like an invisible dome, and they began to rise. The ruins of Centralia faded beneath them, first the collapsed rooftops, then the scorched treetops of the ghostly forest. The wind brushed against their skin, though the barrier kept the flight stable. The Wendigo said nothing. She simply stared out, caught between awe and tightly held tension. Luke glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Better not go too fast. Don't want her to panic and rip my face off mid-flight, he thought. He leaned slightly eastward, toward New York. They traveled at about 250 km/h, so it took them an hour to reach Adams Manor. Luke descended from the sky with surgical precision, guiding his telekinesis with care. He landed in front of the black, Gothic gates of Adams Manor, his feet touching down gently on a bed of dry leaves. Beside him, the Wendigo landed as well, in perfect silence, taking in her new surroundings with unhidden curiosity. Behind Luke floated the bisected body of Zarvok, a formless mass of blackened flesh and bone, Mortimer, and the staff of the dead elder. Each one hovered in the air like trophies, like offerings. And as Luke touched down, he saw her. Wednesday. She was standing just beyond the open gate, waiting for him, as if she had known the exact second he would arrive. Arms crossed, back straight, motionless like a marble statue. She wore her usual black dress, modest and high-necked, with a pristine white collar. Her two braids hung stiffly over her shoulders. Around her, a light fog drifted between the trees, accentuating her presence, as if the very atmosphere had conspired to frame her. But what made Luke tense up wasn't her figure. It was her face. That icy expression, frozen, almost lifeless, her eyes locked on him like two black daggers. How did she get here so fast? Luke thought, sweat forming on his brow. Wednesday was supposed to be at Nevermore. He knew she'd eventually find out he hadn't destroyed the teleportation stones. What he didn't expect was for her to be waiting for him upon landing. Like some figure of final judgment. Luke swallowed. "Hey," he said, forcing a confident smile that didn't convince anyone, not even himself. "I brought you some gifts." With a wave of his hand, he made Zarvok's bisected body float toward her. No more, no less than a mid-level demon, in very good condition apart from the cut, Luke presented. Wednesday gave it a brief, cold glance, then her eyes returned to his, unmoved. Nothing. Not a raised eyebrow. Not a flicker of interest. Great, first offer rejected, Luke thought, but he still had more. He turned his hand and gently guided Mortimer's staff forward. A relic from one of the most powerful psychic houses, its strange runes still faintly glowing. Wednesday barely looked at it. Less than 2 seconds. Second offer dismissed. Shit, Luke thought, realizing he was out of options. If this didn't interest her, then the mangled blob of flesh that was Mortimer certainly wouldn't. He had one card left. Luke turned his head to the left. The Wendigo was still there, standing, watching the exchange with a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. "Sorry, kid, it's this or I'm done," Luke thought as he gently nudged the girl forward. The creature took a few shaky steps, trembling under the weight of Wednesday's glacial stare. The first time she'd looked at her with real attention. "I don't think she needs an introduction. You already know what kind of outcast she is," Luke said, trying to put on a confident smile. Wednesday recognized the fused skull shape, the glowing red eyes, the erratic posture, and the barely restrained bestial aura. She knew exactly what she was looking at, a young Wendigo. A creature whose existence was almost mythical, and yet it was standing there, right in front of her. Several seconds passed, each one feeling eternal for Luke. Wednesday, without taking her eyes off the girl, spoke for the first time. "Why?" The question wasn't for the Wendigo, it was for Luke. "Why what?" Luke asked, playing dumb. Wednesday tilted her head just slightly to look at him. "Why didn't you destroy the stones?" "Because the enemies weren't that strong," he began nervously. "You saw it. I came back without a scratch. It wasn't necessary. Everything was under control." Wednesday repeated the same question, in the exact same tone, as if she hadn't heard a word he'd just said. "Why didn't you destroy the stones?" Luke, knowing he couldn't lie, answered honestly, "Because I was sad and angry about saying goodbye to Edgar forever." Wednesday's eyes blinked once. Her face didn't change, but something in the air seemed to soften. An invisible pressure eased. "I just wanted to hit something, that's all." And then Wednesday vanished in the blink of an eye. Luke closed his eyes, bracing for the reprimand. He accepted it. Wednesday had opened up to him, spoken from an emotional place using words she never used. She asked something simple, destroy the stones. And he hadn't done it. The Wendigo watched from the side, confused. She had seen Luke split open the earth, cut through demons like paper, kill Zarvok effortlessly. And yet here he was. Eyes closed, waiting for punishment from this girl in a dark dress, long braids, and a lifeless expression. Who was she? Then Wednesday reappeared in front of him. She didn't strike him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lifted a hand and gently stroked his cheek. Luke opened his eyes, bewildered. Huh, he thought, confused. Wednesday understood his pain. In her own way, she was forgiving him. "I get it. I would have been in the mood to slaughter things too if I'd lost someone I cared about. I wouldn't want help. I'd want my prey." "Oh, thanks," Luke said with an odd expression, feeling the cold touch of her palm on his cheek. "However," Wednesday continued, her tone absolute, "this will be the last time you do that if you have a safer way to win. You won't be losing loved ones every day." Luke, however, gave a faint smile. It wasn't mocking or arrogant. It felt good to know Wednesday cared that much about him. "Yes, I will. I promise," said Luke, nodding. Then he gently slid an arm around Wednesday's waist, pulling her closer as he leaned in slightly. "And now, don't I get a welcome kiss after my grand victory?" he asked with a teasing smile. Wednesday stared at him. "I suppose you've earned it," she replied, rising onto her toes to kiss him. When they pulled apart, the atmosphere fell silent, or at least it seemed that way until they both felt it, a gaze. They turned their heads slightly. The Wendigo was watching them. More precisely, she was watching Wednesday. Her eyes were wide open. Her expression was hard to read, but it looked confused and thoughtful. Then suddenly, as if something clicked in her mind, the small creature's eyes widened even more. She clenched her fist with a look of revelation, and then slammed it into her other palm with enthusiasm, like she had just solved some ancient riddle. She pointed straight at Wednesday with a thin finger and said, in a rough, gravelly but clear voice, "Mother." Luke blinked. Wednesday frowned slightly. "Mother," Wednesday repeated, her tone monotone and icy, staring at the creature. "Yes, Mother," the Wendigo replied, making it clear. Wednesday remained silent, only turning her face slightly toward Luke, as if needing confirmation that what had just happened was real. "Great, we're parents now and no one told me. Are you handling the emotional part or is it my turn too?" she said dryly. Luke looked at her, offended. Not because of the irony, he was used to that, but because, though he didn't like admitting it out loud, she kind of had a point. In recent months, Wednesday had shown remarkable emotional maturity. She had even said, "I love you" first. "So that's a yes?" Luke asked, more amused than upset. "No, that's a you're sleeping outside if she calls me that again," Wednesday replied. Before she could add another of her acid, sarcastic remarks, footsteps echoed from one of the stone paths leading to the gate. Several figures emerged from the garden mist. First, Natasha, her brow furrowed with concern, walking briskly, almost with a military stride. Upon seeing Luke unharmed, her expression softened, if only slightly. She stopped close to him, eyes scanning him like a field medic. Behind her, Morticia Adams walked with a grace that seemed choreographed. Long black dress, eyebrows raised in interest. Her gaze was analytical, studying not only Luke but the war trophies he had brought along. At her side was Eudora Adams, mother of Gomez and Fester, hunched over, draped in a tattered cloak, smelling faintly of incense, damp earth, and something indefinable. She murmured softly to herself. And finally Lurch, tall, expressionless, his steps slow and erratic. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, firm like a sentinel tree. I see the mission was a success, and without the help of my beloved, Morticia said first, offering a faint smile. She was referring, of course, to Gomez. And you've brought a creature I haven't seen in ages, Eudora added with a wide, crooked smile, disturbing enough to spook even Mortimer Spellman, had he still been alive. The Wendigo instantly hid behind Luke, clinging to his coat as if it were a shield. It was a bizarre sight, a creature capable of tearing limbs with a swipe, trembling like a puppy behind him. Without missing a beat, Luke smirked and said, "Don't be scared, daughter. She's your great-great-grandmother." Wednesday looked at him immediately, not with surprise, not even annoyance. She rolled her eyes. "Daughter?" Morticia asked, tilting her head slightly. "Daughter," Eudora echoed with a raspy laugh. "Already adoptive parents." Natasha frowned, confused. Lurch raised an eyebrow, which, for him, was quite an event. Luke raised his hands. "It's a long story. Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Wednesday looked at him again, this time with a mix of resignation and a hint of threat. He was the only one capable of breaking her composure with such absurd comments. "You better explain that we haven't adopted any child," Wednesday whispered near Luke as they all walked toward the mansion, passing through tall, dark doors. "Relax, I won't ask you to pay half the child's support," Luke whispered back with a mocking smile. "I'll handle the finances. I promise she won't lack anything, though she might miss her maternal figure with symmetrical braids and a homicidal glare." Without looking at him, Wednesday jabbed him in the ribs with surgical precision. Luke didn't dodge it, though he clearly could have. He let out a small laugh, leaning slightly toward her. "I'm just kidding, don't frown. I'll clear up the misunderstanding," Luke said with a faint smile. Wednesday rolled her eyes, but the faintest hint of a curve appeared on her lips. They entered the mansion and made their way to the grand hall, where the lit fireplace cast eerie shadows on the high walls. The Wendigo, still clinging to Luke like a shy cub, looked around with wide eyes. Every animated portrait, every dripping chandelier, every shadowed corner seemed to awaken her curiosity. Everyone took a seat on the many black velvet sofas. Luke and Wednesday sat together, with the Wendigo girl between them, like she truly was their child. Luke began to recount the events since arriving in Centralia. Most importantly, the battle against Mortimer Spellman, the Morax, and later the fight against Zarvok. Gomez, Fester, and Stanley weren't in the mansion. Gomez and Fester had moved as far from Centralia as possible so that, once Luke began acting as bait, the Spellmans wouldn't hesitate to chase him. What they hadn't expected was that the Spellmans had brought a mid-level demon with an extraordinary sense of smell. Morticia kept her hands folded in her lap, not interrupting once. Natasha, arms crossed, listened closely to every word Luke said. She felt a twinge of sadness for Edgar's death, even though she had never met him. Eudora had her eyes closed, but she heard the entire story. And Wednesday, sitting with one leg crossed, watched Luke without blinking. A mid-level demon with an estimated strength of 40 tons and supersonic reflexes, Wednesday said, after Luke finished his account. "And Mortimer," she continued, her voice still calm, but now tinged with evident criticism, with telekinesis that must have hovered around 70 tons at least, capable of turning you into pulp with one slip. Luke didn't answer immediately. "You didn't get hurt and you won quickly and decisively," Wednesday said. "But with the slightest mistake, one distraction, one bad decision, you could have ended up dismembered. Or worse." "I thought the lecture was over," Luke thought, looking at her. She wasn't entirely wrong. Zarvok's strength had been overwhelming, literally. Over 40 tons of raw physical power, with a body structure designed purely for killing. And Mortimer, His telekinesis was far superior to Luke's. Luke had walked away without a scratch. True, but not because of any brute force advantage. His telekinesis alone maxed out at around 15 tons. Nowhere near the level of his enemies, but he never fought with strength alone. He had outmaneuvered them using the best of his abilities, and Eclipse, the weapon that turned any telekinetic slash into a death sentence. His extended domain gave him a panoramic sense of threats before they emerged. His future sight allowed him to dodge lethal movements with surgical precision. And his blue aura enabled him to issue mental commands and weave illusions into his enemies' minds. Every second of the battle had been calculated. There was no room for error. On top of that, there was his newest factor, the green aura. Regeneration, enhanced strength, muscular endurance. It didn't just heal him. It kept him at peak condition for longer. All of that allowed him to end both battles quickly, without giving his opponents a chance to coordinate or adapt. So it wasn't the easy battle you made it seem at first. It could have gone very wrong, Wednesday concluded. Her tone wasn't cruel, it was concerned. She wasn't scolding him for weakness. She was doing it because, despite everything, she cared too much about him coming back alive. And for her, that was practically a declaration of love. Morticia watched the scene in silence, a faint smile forming on her lips. Years ago, she would have never imagined this. Her daughter, antisocial, distant, completely uninterested in human relationships of any kind, was in love. And not only that, she was worried, frustrated, demanding that her boyfriend take care of himself. In her own way, of course, with an icy tone, a blade-sharp glare, and not a single word spoken beyond what was necessary. "My little withered flower," Morticia murmured to herself, in the sweet voice of someone savoring a delicious irony. "But that didn't happen," Luke said, raising his right hand with his palm open. Around his palm, the space began to distort, and from nothing, Eclipse, the Poe's sole weapon, appeared. It emerged from thin air, summoned by his will, as if it had always been there, waiting for the moment. The black blade bore ancient runes that glowed faintly. Wednesday didn't continue scolding Luke. She had no intention of creating a scene in front of troublesome witnesses. That wasn't her style. Instead, she observed the sole weapon with curiosity, and Luke even handed it to her so she could examine it as much as she wanted. Everyone looked at Eclipse like the ancient relic it was. The Poe weapon trembled slightly, as if displeased by unfamiliar hands, but it obeyed the will of its wielder. Once everyone had taken a look, Luke lowered his arm and Eclipse vanished. And as if it were the most natural thing in the world, every gaze in the room shifted to the creature, sitting on the floor near one of the side shelves. The Wendigo was playing with a grotesque little statue, a hybrid between a gargoyle and a faceless child, that Luke had given her so she wouldn't get bored. She had taken it from one of the shelves, and no one had said a word. In this house, terrifying objects were practically toys. "So, how did you end up adopting a Wendigo girl?" Morticia asked, raising an eyebrow with equal parts curiosity and amusement. Her tone was gentle, as if she were talking about a household mishap, not a mythological nightmare creature. And she had called her girl quite intentionally. She had observed her movements, her body language. Even though, according to Luke's story, she could be over 40 years old if she was captured during the Centralia disaster, as all signs pointed to. For a Wendigo, that was still just the end of childhood. A creature with a lifespan of 500 years, developed differently. And especially this one, who had spent her entire life in captivity. "I didn't adopt her. That was a joke. She chose to follow me," Luke replied with a shrug. That caused a faint murmur among those present. Even Natasha tilted her head slightly. "By her own choice?" Eudora asked, pursing her wrinkled lips. "That's not common, not even among the more social outcast monsters. And even less so for one who's been a prisoner her whole life," added Morticia. "She should crave freedom, not company." "What can I say? I'm charming," Luke replied with a half-smile, glancing at Wednesday. Wednesday shot him a sideways look. She didn't say anything, but the glint in her eyes clearly said don't start. Luke turned to Morticia. Can she stay here? I mean, I don't know a more fitting place. Morticia didn't hesitate even half a second. Of course, she'll be welcome. Eudora let out a high-pitched giggle and nodded enthusiastically. The more misunderstood beings, the better. The Addams family has always been a refuge for those who don't belong. Luke nodded, satisfied, and looked toward the Wendigo. Well, that only leaves one question. What's your name? He asked, crouching down to her level. The girl looked at him, then she shrugged and shook her head. Nothing. You don't know? Morticia asked, with a note of quiet sadness in her voice. The Wendigo shook her head again. She didn't seem sad, just indifferent, as if she'd never needed a name. Then we'll have to give you one, Luke said, standing back up, hand on his chin, thoughtful. How about Shadow? He proposed seriously, as if it were a brilliant idea. Wednesday shot him a glare. That sounds like a pet's name, and it's gender-neutral. She's a girl, she said disapprovingly, without blinking. Luke raised an eyebrow. What's wrong with it being neutral? It's mysterious and impactful. It's cliché and only impressive to you, Wednesday replied, with a tone sharper than Eclipse. So demanding. Then what brilliant names do you have in mind? Luke asked. The Wendigo watched them, as if she were observing her almost parents arguing about her future. Wednesday slowly turned her head toward the Wendigo, studying her. Naira, Wednesday finally said. Luke blinked. Naira. Yes, feminine and short, Wednesday nodded. The Wendigo lifted her head. She looked first at Wednesday, then at Luke, and nodded, signaling that she liked the name. Looks like she likes it. Naira it is. Gotta admit it's got style, Luke said. Obviously, Wednesday replied, emotionless. And just like that, the name of the mythological creature was sealed. Morticia offered to give Naira a bath and change her dirty, torn clothes. Luke agreed and left her in the hands of his mother-in-law. Naira seemed reluctant to part from Luke and Wednesday, but she had no choice. Luke and Wednesday went to her room to talk in private, since the last time they saw each other in person had been during winter break. Today's Friday, the perfect Wednesday Addams skipping class, not great for your GPA, Luke said, sitting at the edge of her double bed. I have a special pass because we're at war. Larissa gave it to me, Wednesday said, sitting down and naturally settling herself on top of Luke. That's great. Will you stay here for the weekend? Luke asked hopefully, looking at her intently. He missed her and wanted to spend the whole weekend together. With little to no training, just some rest after losing Edgar and fighting Mortimer and Zarvok. He'd earned it. It wasn't every day that someone took down one of the Spellman demon elders and a century-old mid-tier demon. No, I have to go back. There are things I need too. Wednesday began, noticing the disappointment flicker in Luke's eyes as he looked down. She paused. She'd planned to tell him that the war didn't stop, and she had tasks to attend to, intel waiting for her in her room at Nevermore. Plus, she had school, homework and assignments due on Monday. Her routine had been quite strict lately. Fine, I'll stay this weekend. I can take a couple of days off, Wednesday said, changing her mind. Really? Luke asked, looking up again, hope reigniting. Yes, but we're not going to be lazy. We'll train and plan future moves. The war goes on, Wednesday nodded. Oh, such a tactician, Luke said with a smile. Of course. We can't get complacent over one victory. We need to be ready for anything, Wednesday replied. And so, the weekend ended faster than either of them would have liked. Wednesday returned to Nevermore, and Luke resumed his hellish training routine with Stanley, Fester, and Gomez, although the latter wasn't always present due to being incredibly busy. Despite killing a demonic elder, Luke knew he had to keep training, harder than ever. He'd seen the gap between his telekinesis and Mortimer's firsthand. He needed to grow stronger in all his auras and learn to wield Eclipse more effectively. Gomez had begun teaching him fencing, something that was proving very useful. Naira also trained, though in a calmer way and without anyone demanding it of her. It was simply in her nature. Fester even took her out to hunt wild animals and even monsters. And so time passed. January 12. I returned to Nevermore on Monday, feeling renewed. After spending the entire weekend with Luke, most of my irritation and foul mood had faded. I forgave him, even though he didn't keep his promise, only because I saw the sadness in his eyes after losing Edgar. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been so lenient. The death of his great-great-grandfather affected him more than he admits. His new strength is making him more confident, and that says a lot, coming from someone who was already arrogant by nature. Not in a bad way, though. He takes his battles very seriously, just like I do. What bothers me is how kamikaze he gets, when he could easily avoid a life-or-death situation. If I have to be the one to give him a harsh dose of reality, I'll do it without blinking, for his sake and mine. Coming back to Nevermore felt like returning to an illusion. The facade of normality is so absurd, it sometimes feels like a poorly written play. Classes, homework, practical training, school events like the Poe Cup right around the corner, seniors worrying about who's next to receive a letter of recommendation from the outcasts' universities. But beneath that calm, there's a tension in the air. Outside, there's fire. The war can't be seen, but it's there, silent. The division has never been clearer. In theory, we're all on the same side. The outcast council, justice, very different from normie justice, of course, order, etc. The Spellmans were publicly condemned. The evidence was undeniable. Dealings with demons, betrayal of humanity. The worst accusation any outcast, or in this case, an entire outcast family, can face. Edward Spellman's ultimate goal, the extermination of normies, at least in America. It wasn't just irrational hatred driving Edward. From what Edgar told Luke, and Luke told me, Edward had a rational reason, if it can even be called that. According to him, normies are destroying the planet. They promote war, pollution, control. And if no one stops them, they'll eventually wipe us out too, as collateral damage. A speech claiming normies are worse than demons. That's why so many secretly sympathize with the Spellmans. At first, it was just a few. Then they grew. Now they hide behind neutral flags. They say they don't support violence, that they prefer coexistence, but it's all lies. They're opportunists and passive accomplices. Even at Nevermore, the division and tension are noticeable. Despite being historically more pro-normie than other institutions, even hosting an annual integration day in Jericho, where students are forced to help the human community with rural and social tasks, most students can barely hide their contempt. And the people of Jericho make no effort to hide theirs either. Normies have always seen the students of the Gothic Academy hidden in the woods as freaks. So even if Nevermore is a pro-normie institution, its students have always been neutral or held a negative view of normies because of how they've been treated. When it came out among the students that Crackstone was actually a genocidal murderer of the outcast and that he possessed the demonic Book of SAGA, it didn't help things. And that was partly mine and Luke's fault. The relationship has always been tense. But now it's worse. On paper, we have the upper hand, since the criminals are the Spellmans, who are going against the outcast council. The Addams family, my family, with my father as the head of the demon extermination department, has resources and power. Other important psychic families like the Umbrio, the Thorpes, and the Faulkners, one of the 6 great families, Nathaniel Faulkner was a founder of Nevermore, are strong and reliable allies. Even though the Umbrio and Thorpe families aren't considered as ancient as the 6 great families, their power and resources shouldn't be underestimated. It's fortunate that they're reliable allies, with trusted connections to Luke, Xavier, Veronica, and Stalin. But it would be a mistake to think the balance doesn't tremble, because it does. The Von Drachens, another of the 6 great families, present themselves as allies of the council, but I don't trust them. Too clean, too perfect. Their ancestor was the founder of the Academy of Dark Arts, the other outcast institution in the United States, besides Nevermore. However, that academy is known for its blatant supremacism. They openly despise normies as if they were pests. It would make sense for them to sympathize with the Spellmans. I have no proof, so nothing can be done about it, unfortunately. Then there are the Frumps, my mother's family. Officially, they're neutral, but knowing that doesn't bring me any comfort. My mother comes from that family, and I know her relationship with her sister and mother, my aunt and grandmother, is strained. Marriage between members of the 6 great families is almost unthinkable. Too much pride, too much lineage to protect. And when it does happen, like with my parents, it's inevitable that one of the 2 families feels like they lost. The Adamses won. My mother's psychic talent now runs through my veins, and my stupid brothers, and we carry the Adams name instead of Frump. Everyone in the Frump family felt like they lost. Not just 2 powerful psychics, but an heiress with 2 auras, me. That's why I don't fully trust them. I just hope they don't side with the Spellmans. I know their history leans closer to supremacism than to coexistence. I know they look at normies the way one looks at a cockroach crawling across a velvet tablecloth. But I also know my mother, raised in that elegant darkness, has always hated demons. To her, making pacts with such creatures is the ultimate betrayal of humanity and a disgrace to the psychic legacy. She always taught me, there's a line you never cross when studying dark books. That makes me assume my grandmother must think the same way. Although with that woman, assuming is always dangerous. Sometimes, I wonder how absurd that wedding between my parents must have been. A line of Frumps, gothic and elegant, sitting in complete silence, judging my father's every move as if it were a personal offense to their psychic legacy. Thinking about that led my mind to Luke, and the idea of a future wedding with him. Would we ever get married, after the war, after we finish high school? My parents got married at just 18, a few months after graduating from Nevermore. It's a thought that should repel me. Marriage, in essence, is a ceremony designed to turn emotions into legal contracts. An event filled with social expectations I neither respect nor wish to fulfill. But thinking about it with him doesn't bother me. In fact, it might not be so bad. Wednesday Poe, I thought. It didn't sound so bad in my head. Solid, dark, distinctive. Of course, that would mean leaving the Adams name behind, but I wouldn't see it as a loss. If Luke were to take my last name, that would be unacceptable. Erasing the Poe bloodline would be an atrocity not even love could justify. I wouldn't allow it. And he, by conviction and because of what he promised Edgar, wouldn't either. Just then, the door to the room opened. "Hey," said Enid, stepping in with the pace of someone trying hard not to look anxious. "Are you busy?" I know where her anxiety comes from, even if she tries to mask it behind that calm facade. I slowly took my hands off the typewriter. "No, I was just working on my novel," I replied, as if my mind hadn't been wandering seconds ago through the thought of a possible wedding with Luke. Also, I lied. I wasn't working on my novel, but on a journal I decided to start a few days ago. A way to stay organized, with so many things demanding attention. Enid took off her uniform jacket with automatic motions, pretending not to glance sideways at the typewriter or my face. "How were your mini vacations?" she asked with a tone so rehearsed, it felt like an insult to her own intelligence. "Normal," I said in a flat tone. I saw the subtle twitch of her left eyebrow rising just a millimeter, and I knew she still wasn't satisfied with the answer I gave. "And Luke, did he complete his mission?" she asked, like someone making small talk about the weather. I slowly turned my face toward her and narrowed my eyes. So easy to read. Ever since she decided to stop pursuing him, she's made an admirable effort to appear indifferent. She doesn't say his name, doesn't look for him, tries not to listen too closely when we talk on video calls. But that doesn't mean she's stopped caring. "He's alive, unharmed. Didn't keep his promise, of course," I replied coldly. She had overheard the conversation I had with Luke the other day, so she knew he had gone on a decoy mission to retrieve the Poe soul weapon. Enid let out a dry, humorless laugh, typical of him. Throwing himself into battle when he could have had help from your father and uncle. She didn't sound angry. She sounded resigned. I already gave him the necessary lecture, I said. She nodded naturally. Good. Someone has to. Sometimes he needs to be pulled off that superiority cloud before he ends up in real danger. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like someone who knows him far too well. I didn't respond, so she continued. I guess he must be affected by what happened with Edgar too, right? I looked at her. Of course she knew. Luke must have told her about the ghost Edgar who helped train him when they were together. He's sad. He won't fully admit it, but he is, I finally said. I noticed it during the days we spent together, even though he tried to act strong. The way he looked at the pendant where Edgar once rested, one he now always wears. Enid lay on her side on her bed and looked at me. Then maybe you should, I don't know, be a little soft with him. Not so cold, just this once. I raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. She held my gaze with a slight, almost teasing smile. I mean, if you need a tactical excuse, just call it post-grief emotional support to boost the soldiers' morale, she added. I already did. I skipped school on Friday and spent 3 full days with him. I just got back today, I answered flatly. I saw her eyes blink, just barely. Not out of jealousy, this time, but from a strange mix of surprise and understanding. Fair point, she said, and after that we both returned to what we were doing. In that moment, we shared something. The fact that we both knew Luke more than we cared to admit. And both of us, in our own way, cared about him. Wednesday's POV. Journal entry, January 28. The days go by, slow and repetitive, at least during daylight hours. At Nevermore, classes proceed as usual, theory and practice. Essays on ancient outcast history, group projects, unfortunately. Though in that regard, I've found another use for Enid. I can partner with her and avoid socializing with any other idiot in this institution. Eugene would be the other option, but I must admit Enid is smarter than him and talks less. Though in the psychic-specific subject, I have no choice but to tolerate Eugene. We had a school event, celebrated as if we weren't on the brink of a civil war, something our dreadfully dull outcast history teacher will no doubt add to his stupid, never-ending book. But at night, things get interesting. My real schedule begins when everyone goes to sleep. Thanks to my family, I have permission to leave Nevermore. My father holds a key position in the Outcast Council, head of the Demon Extermination Department. My mother, despite appearances, still retains considerable influence in the council's political wing. And my uncle Octavius, ever discreet, coordinates covert operations with legal gray zones that would terrify more than one lawyer. So yes, I have authorization to act and first-hand information. Not every night involves a mission, but when it does, I won't deny it's entertaining to have a deadly sparring session. The adrenaline, wounding the enemy. Still, I don't let my emotions control me. I'm as efficient as possible. Usually, if we capture suspects, they commit suicide before talking. Instant lethal poison and a false tooth. It's like their signature. Enid accompanies me on each of these missions. Her strength is useful and improving with every outing. Most importantly, she's reliable. Unlike others. During the day, while pretending to pay attention in class, I observe. The students, their gestures, their phrases, their silences. Teenagers, yes. But ideologies are inherited. Principles trickle down. And sometimes, the transparency of a child betrays an entire family. I made a list, a side task, unofficial, not urgent, but potentially useful in the future. I write down names, surnames, behaviors. Political hints dropped accidentally. Reactions when the name Spellman comes up or Luke. There are many students at Nevermore. The school functions as both middle and high school. all under the same Gothic institution, large enough to comfortably house everyone. It's impossible to keep a complete and detailed record of everyone with my current schedule. But when I do have free time, rare but not non-existent, I dedicate it to that. My black notebook is divided by outcast races: psychics, vampires, werewolves, shapeshifters, gorgons, etc. Then sorted by suspicion level. Most are irrelevant. Children with minor abilities, families without real power, hybrids with diluted bloodlines and values closer to normies than to any classical outcast tradition. But there are exceptions. There always are. For example, Xavier Thorpe, descendant of a prominent psychic family, is here. He is Luke's best friend. Ajax Petropoulos, the middle son of one of the four most important Gorgon families in outcast society, is also a close friend of Luke. Both are useful, loyal, and far from untalented. Being considered a true friend by Luke is no easy feat. Luke holds a deep distrust toward nearly everyone he meets. His patience is limited, and his standard of loyalty brutally high. The fact that Xavier and Ajax have reached that level of closeness already says a lot. Even I respect them for achieving it. I know Luke still talks to them often, whether by message or playing video games when he has free time at Adams Manor. And yet, I don't trust them blindly. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because their parents are not them. So far, everything indicates that both the Thorpe and Petropoulos families are loyal to the council. There are no traces of betrayal or signs of radical ideology. Still, I remain watchful. Enid, however, is different. I trust her more than anyone here. Friendship is a volatile emotion. Enid's obsession, on the other hand, is much more stable. What she feels for Luke is a deep obsession to protect him, to help him in any way possible. And in a werewolf, that means permanence. It's not a fleeting emotion, it's an instinct. A fixation embedded in the marrow. As for her family, they don't belong to the oldest or most powerful werewolf clans. They come from a good middle-tier lineage, hardworking, without strong political ties or supremacist ambitions. Her father and mother are moderate, her older brothers the same. They neither sympathize with normies nor despise them. And with their only daughter actively assisting Luke on missions that clearly oppose the Spellmans and everything they represent, it's almost impossible that her family could secretly be siding with the Spellmans. Werewolves are fiercely loyal to their pack. And having Enid on our side is like having the entire Sinclair family under our banner. A biological guarantee, one might call it. That's why I keep her close, not out of nostalgia, not out of friendship. Out of strategy. Though I'll admit, only within these pages, that her constant presence makes the room feel a little less empty. As for Luke, ever since I returned to Nevermore and he began his training, we've had a video call every evening after classes, always at the same hour. He appears from the stone-walled room in my house, usually with his hair a mess from recent training, and occasionally bearing signs of electrocution courtesy of Fester. He told me, without much detail, but with a smile meant to look modest, that he finally got his revenge. Not with words, of course. With skill. Progress by his standards. Dangerous by mine. He doesn't tell me the specifics of his training regimen, but I know it's madness, even by my standards. Unfortunately, he's incredibly stubborn, and since I'm not there, I can't control him. He's always worried about me. He doesn't say it dramatically, but he always slips it in at the end of our calls. He knows I'm not just attending classes, he knows I'm on missions. And he always says that if I ever need help on a mission, I should call him. I always say yes. I never do. It's vital that he trains his fourth aura. His power can truly tip the scale of this war. He's already proven that by killing Elliot, Mortimer, and a mid-demon. On the other hand, he doesn't know I'm sharing a room with Enid again. He doesn't know she's the one who accompanies me on every nightly mission. He doesn't know that while he trains, We fight against targets who, if defeated, self-terminate before they can be interrogated. Self-destruction in seconds, poisoned tongues bitten off, internal explosions. More than once, I've returned to Nevermore covered in blood and entrails. Every confrontation is lethal. I'm always with Enid. Occasionally, we're joined by trusted allies. But usually, it's just the two of us. In many missions, we've come back wounded but never seriously. Not yet. I know it sounds hypocritical. After all, I scolded Luke for going alone to confront an elder Spellman demon and a mid-tier demon. But this is different. The enemies we face aren't high-level. Dangerous, yes. Lethal, somewhat. My specialty is calculation, measured risk, acceptable probability, you could call it. I don't tell him this. I don't want him to worry when he needs to focus on his training. I finished writing and turned in my chair. Enid was sitting on her bed with her laptop on her legs, headphones hanging around her neck, her face lit by the screen. She was typing quickly. Didn't look like schoolwork. Most likely, she was editing a new post for her blog, which she had recently reopened. Enid, you're friends with Yoko, right? I asked directly, already forming an idea. Her fingers froze on the keyboard, and she looked at me. Yoko, yeah, we're friends. Why? You should start investigating her, I said. Investigating her. Yes, get closer to her, learn what she thinks, how she was raised, what her family believes, the basics, I replied in a monotone voice. Enid frowned. Why? Because she belongs to the Noctaris clan, one of the 7 oldest and most powerful vampire clans. Traditional, reserved. They haven't had any direct alliance with the Spellmans, not in the last 80 years at least. But they also haven't actively hunted them, despite having members in key council positions. That kind of passive neutrality makes them suspicious, even if only to a mild degree. I don't think Yoko's a problem. I've known her for years. I've never once heard her speak badly about normies. Not once. Actually, she's a lesbian. Her girlfriend is Divina, a siren, same year as us. Do you really think someone like that could be hiding a radical ideology? Said Enid, shaking her head. I'm not talking about her specifically, though I have doubts. I'm more concerned about her family, I said, trying to remain patient and persuade her. And you think the Noctaris clan would even allow something like that if they were extremists? They let her be who she is. That says a lot, doesn't it? Enid shot back. I stayed silent for a moment, then slowly shook my head. You don't know how they truly see her, Enid. One thing is what Yoko shows. Another is what her parents actually think. Just because her clan hasn't publicly disowned her doesn't mean they accept her. Enid frowned deeper, confused. Then why don't they pressure her or force her to change? Yoko, like most outcasts of our generation, grew up surrounded by normie culture, I explained calmly. Cell phones, social media, shows with inclusive morals. External stimuli that old clans and families can't fully filter anymore. Maybe her parents are more tolerant of normies, or maybe not. What I want to know is whether that tolerance is genuine, or just a facade to maintain reputation. Enid looked at me, still unsure. Besides, I continued, being a lesbian doesn't mean she's free of radical ideology. Not having shown direct hatred proves nothing. Are you saying Yoko might think like the Spellmans? Enid asked. I'm saying you don't know, and neither do I replied, tone unchanged. It's possible her family accepts her because, despite her sexual orientation, she has talent, decent strength by their standards, and the right ideals. She helped me during the Blood Moon when the Spellmans tried to revive Crackstone. She got off the bus and helped me fight the zombies, Enid said, still visibly conflicted. I knew this was hard for her. The reason behind the task, labeling someone as an ally or a potential enemy. Not knowing if everything shared over the years had been genuine or just part of a facade. You don't know anything about her parents, do you? I asked. Enid blinked. What? You've been her friend for years, but you don't know if her parents are moderate, extremist, neutral. how she was raised. That alone is reason enough to be suspicious. She fell silent. That was my moment. I had no more logical arguments left, so I used the one thing I knew would work. If we get information on the Noctaris, it could help Luke. He'd win the war and finally get to live in peace, without killers chasing him. I saw it instantly. That slight shift in her expression. The way she pressed her lips together, then exhaled in resignation. Fine, I'll do it. You brought up Luke to manipulate me, didn't you? Enid said. Did it work or not? I answered, raising an eyebrow. Enid rolled her eyes, closed her laptop, and muttered, You're the worst. Thanks, I replied. She didn't say it with hatred, just that familiar mix of annoyance and resignation that had already become part of our routine. Wednesday's POV. Journal entry, February 28. A month has passed. The war continues in silence. Its intensity has increased slightly, but there haven't been many changes. After our conversation, Enid began to get closer to Yoko, much closer. Sleepovers, group study sessions, activities I would never choose to get involved in, not even under threat. But the result was surprisingly effective. I didn't think she'd managed to learn so much about Yoko's upbringing and her family's more hidden ideals so quickly. It's well known that vampires are naturally closed off, reserved. And if that's true among themselves, it doubles when the person they're speaking to is a werewolf. Even more so considering Enid used to date Luke, direct enemy of the Spellmans. Even so, Enid pulled it off. It's true there is public information about vampire clans, especially for families like mine. The Adams have always had access to more privileged knowledge. And ever since the Outcast Council began promoting coexistence with normies, at least on paper, the more powerful vampire clans, including the 7 great ones, adopted more modern policies. For years now, the law of normie blood abstinence has been enforced among them. Not out of kindness, out of diplomacy. The punishment for breaking that law is severe. And these days, most clans remain neutral or aligned with the council's official stance. But the appearance of the Spellmans, sudden, radical, and with a strength no one anticipated despite the heavy losses they suffered at Luke's hands, is shaking those foundations. What once was stable neutrality is beginning to crack, and what once felt like a peace agreement now feels like a taut rope, ready to snap if pulled hard enough. Yoko's parents aren't extremists like the Spellmans, but it would be wrong to say they're fond of normies either. Their opinions, though hidden on the surface, are known to Yoko, and Enid managed to uncover them subtly. They hold a modest sense of supremacy, seeing normies as inferior, clumsy, and dangerous. They don't advocate for extermination, but if it could be done quietly, I'd say they'd be in favor. Considering vampires have had more historical conflicts with normies than any other marginalized race, this isn't a trivial detail. Yoko, for her part, is an anomaly shaped by normie culture. She uses social media, listens to pop, openly came out as a lesbian without punishment, but she doesn't show open sympathy toward coexistence. No active defense, she's quiet, and in a war like this, silence also takes sides. So the level of suspicion toward her and her family has climbed a notch. As for Enid, I'm still surprised by how easily she got that information. I thought it would be harder, even after being her friend for years, but it seems that when it comes to Luke, her emotional compass gets recalibrated. Journal entry, March 14. The war continues. No visible outbreaks, no massive clashes, but it moves silently, and that tends to be more dangerous. The night missions are ongoing, same with intelligence gathering. But what's changed the most over the past 2 weeks isn't the external front. It's the internal one. My cohabitation with Enid is no longer simply functional. It's not just about sharing reports or coordinating missions. Something is shifting, not explosively, more like a slow stitch. I wouldn't say our friendship has resumed. That would be too premature, sentimental, and strangely awkward to say aloud. But yes, I do consider that I once had a friendship with Enid. Brief and fleeting. One that broke before it could solidify, because of Luke, of course. Even if it's hard to admit, it would be foolish to ignore the friendship. It was during the first few months, after I arrived at Nevermore, back when I barely spoke to Luke. We were both too self-centered to even address each other. And when we did, it was out of obligation. Our psychic abilities class forced us to team up since neither of us had a partner. In those first months, I was alone, as usual in all my previous schools. Except there was a variable, Enid. She was stubborn enough to become my friend. Despite my coldness, sharp remarks, and all the clear signals I sent to scare her off. She was the first person I ever told something personal to. The promise I made to myself never to cry again after the death of my scorpion Nero, killed by a group of psychic children. The first at that time, since I eventually told Luke about it too. She also shared something with me, that she was training because of a promise. She never said exactly what it was, but now I know it was a promise she made to Luke. I remember her anxiety at not seeing progress, her frustrations and doubts. She was my first friend in life. And if Luke read this, he'd probably make some sarcastic comment about how sad and antisocial that sounds. He always makes that kind of joke, even mocking himself, since he was antisocial too. But I don't see it that way. I never needed those kinds of connections. I didn't seek them. I didn't value them as something useful. Social relationships were a waste of time, a game of masks with no logical purpose. At least until Enid came along, and I somehow made her my first friend, even if I couldn't admit it back then. She was an unexpected element, but not an unpleasant one. Of course, it didn't last. There was no time for anything to solidify. Soon after came Rowan's attempted murder, the hide, the prophecy I shared with Luke, the murders in Jericho. I started spending more time with Luke, investigating, fighting, getting to know him. And without even realizing it, I fell in love. I knew, even if I didn't want to admit it at the time, that she felt something for him too, that there was a history. A promise and a long wait, but back then I didn't care. My bond with Luke became more important than any other relationship. And when that happened, I decided that feeling deserved more attention than any connection I had before, including the budding, not quite defined friendship I had with Enid. Enid also noticed how close I was getting to Luke. And knowing both his personality and mine, she clearly had her suspicions. She distanced herself from me, and I don't blame her. The friendship we had, the one that was just beginning to take shape, slowly eroded in silence. Until it broke completely, when Luke made his choice and chose me. Now, nearly 2 years later, we share a room and time together again. At first, for strategic reasons, and because I knew Enid was useful to Luke, and that she said she wouldn't approach him or try to win him back. But, as with everything truly inevitable, it changed. Now we eat together. Not because we have to. Not because we need to go over reports or coordinate patrol schedules. Simply because we do. Because we're in the same place, and neither of us minds anymore. And at night, if there are no missions, we talk. Small things. Conversations with no tactical purpose behind them. Minor behaviors that, coming from others, I would classify as a waste of time. But with Enid, I don't feel that way. That's the most unsettling part. That I didn't expect it, nor plan for it. And that despite knowing she was Luke's ex, the first one he chose before falling in love with me. Despite knowing she still remembers him, still thinks of him, and still loves him. It doesn't bother me, not the way it should have in the past. Back when I even tried to send her to her death, though I changed my mind and saved her. The March 14 entry was the last time I wrote in my journal. A week has passed, and I haven't written anything since. Not for lack of events, but from an excess of thought. I was sitting in front of my typewriter, ready to continue the journal, but at exactly 10:03 p.m., something broke the inertia. a loud thud against the window frame. I opened it, and a raven flew in, black as ink with a scroll tied to one of its legs. I unrolled the parchment. The raven didn't move until I finished reading. Then it flew away. "A new mission?" Enid asked as she stepped out of the bathroom, towel around her neck, drying her hair. She was wearing bright bubblegum pink training clothes. I nodded, without lifting my eyes from the parchment. "Yes, it doesn't say much. Just a location, a town in the eastern hills of Vermont, about 200 kilometers from here. We're the closest." She stopped, raising a brow. "What kind of mission?" "Recon and possible intervention." My voice was flat, but the contents of the message were anything but light. "Recent disappearances, presence of irregular psychic energy, possible dark implications." I paused briefly before adding, "The kind of case that used to be taboo. But ever since the Spellmans started this war, many have begun engaging in pagan dealings openly." "Any idea what kind of dark implication?" she asked, her tone more serious. "No, but worst-case demonic pacts." Then I added, "Go change," and my eyes couldn't help but register disapproval at the pink hue of her outfit. She noticed immediately. She knows colors like that are an eyesore to me. "What? I can't summon ancient terror dressed in pink?" she asked with a faint smile. "Only if you want to die ridiculously. Move," I said without a hint of humor. She mumbled something under her breath, probably a complaint about the lack of humor in this room, and walked over to her wardrobe. I was alone for a moment. I looked at the parchment again. Elton Inn. A small town. Luckily, Enid didn't take long to change, and we left as soon as possible. 200 kilometers isn't short. We're not as fast as Luke, breaking the sound barrier mid-flight, but in an hour or less we'll be there. Wednesday's POV. The trip to the town took us about 45 minutes. Not bad, we covered 200 kilometers. The journey was silent, not out of discomfort, but for the sake of efficiency. We reached the outskirts of the town at around 11:16 p.m. And from the very first second, something felt wrong. The streets were completely empty, too empty even for such a late hour. The atmosphere was strange. Every window in the houses had its curtains drawn. There were no open stores, not even a 24-hour supermarket. Nothing. As if the people here were afraid to go out at night. It reminded me of the murders in Jericho in the past, when people stopped leaving their homes after dark for fear of the serial killer on the loose. We moved without speaking, only hand signals and exchanged glances. We had done this enough times to understand each other without a single word. The town was small, much smaller than Jericho or Shadowside. No one peeked out, not even through a crack in the curtains. Enid sniffed the air. "I smell blood, but it's not normal. It's dirtier than usual," she whispered with a disgusted expression as she led the way. Maybe we were getting closer to the place where the killer or killers were hiding the dead bodies, and that's why Enid could smell the rotting stench. I couldn't. My sense of smell was nowhere near hers. We walked at a moderate but stealthy pace, heading for a hill to the east. At its peak stood a mansion. Even from below, it looked a bit imposing, I must say, blackened by time and terribly neglected. It looked more haunted than my own house, and that's saying a lot. We slipped into the forest, surrounding the hill, without making a sound. The path was winding and neglected. A stone trail, half covered in dry leaves. In less than 5 minutes, we were standing in front of a rusted gate. We jumped over it without touching it, a perfect arc. We landed silently on the other side. The mansion was surrounded by crumbling stone ruins, broken statues, and collapsed arches. There were no lights, no cracks. Everything was sealed shut. We started circling the building, looking for a way in without having to knock down a door. Every entrance was sealed. Boarded up with rotted but solid wood. Same with the windows. "Yeah, the smell of rotting blood is definitely coming from this mansion," Enid murmured. Eventually, we found something. A pair of iron cellar doors, half sunken into the ground. typical access to a basement or underground storage. The padlock was old and covered in rust. Enid crouched down and took hold of the lock with one hand. Then, with a bit of pressure, she snapped it like a dry twig. "Ready?" she asked, looking at me. I nodded, and she opened the doors. A sharp screech echoed as the rusted doors creaked open. Without hesitation, we began to descend. Side by side, all my senses fully alert. And then, even I could smell it. The stench, it wasn't just blood, it was decay. Enid stopped one step ahead and whispered without turning, "It's definitely coming from the basement." I nodded, and we kept going. The descent led to a damp stone corridor, mossy and windowless. The walls were coated in slime and moss, and the floor was stained with old marks. At the end of the hallway, an old wooden door unlocked. We opened it slowly. The basement was larger than I expected. Towering wooden shelves rose like improvised walls, filled with old objects, jars, rusted tools, dusty boxes. Cobwebs hung like curtains. Dust coated every surface. It looked less like a basement and more like a makeshift labyrinth. We moved through the aisles. Enid's breathing was steady and controlled. Her eyes scanned everything, her ears attentive to every sound. We advanced like that for almost 3 minutes, until we turned a corner and saw it. An open chamber, clearer than the ones before. The floor was covered in symbols drawn in something that definitely wasn't paint. A ritual circle, complex, with precise proportions and heretical geometry. At the center, a creature lay sleeping. It was hard to give it a name. It clearly wasn't a demon. It was a formless, humanoid mass with torn skin in some places and patches of scales or hair in others. 4 arms, or what was left of them, protruded from its torso at impossible angles. A dislocated jaw hung open like a beaten animal's, drooling something thick and dark. Eyes, too many eyes, and not all of them on its face. One word came to mind. "Chimera," I murmured. Though, of course, far more horrifying than the one from Greek mythology. It rested like a dog, lying in a dried pool of blood and ash. It didn't move, but its presence alone made the air feel heavier. I exchanged a look with Enid. Neither of us spoke, but we already knew what had happened to the normies who'd gone missing in this town. I began channeling dark energy into my right hand. The darkness condensed slowly, silently. It took shape, curved, elongated, lethal. A scythe. Beside me, Enid was readying herself too. Her claws slid out with a soft, almost inaudible sound. Her pupils narrowed. Her breathing grew even quieter. We didn't need any more signals. We both knew what had to be done. Kill that thing, before it woke up and fulfilled an even more twisted purpose. But just as we took the first step, a voice rose calmly. Well, I wasn't expecting visitors. We turned around in unison. From a dark corner of the basement emerged a tall, bald man with pale, sickly skin. He wore a filthy lab coat, stained with dried blood, ink, and something I preferred not to identify. Round glasses sat crooked on his angular face. His eyes, small, bright, radiated a barely contained madness beneath a thin layer of false politeness. "I don't mean to sound rude," he continued in a nasal voice, "but I'm afraid you're interfering in a delicate transaction." I didn't respond immediately. I just stared at him. My mind was already connecting the dots. The stained coat, the ritualized basement, the creature stitched together with blood and lesser sorcery. "Let me guess," I said at last, my tone dry. "A mediocre outcast, desperate to climb one rung higher on the food chain. And since there's chaos now, you're taking advantage of it, killing people and playing with dark books." Clearly, I was disappointed. I'd expected more. A more powerful outcast or someone with a direct link to the Spellmans. The man didn't take offense. He just smiled. "Yes," he said bluntly. "Biology, talent, blood, we're all born with a ceiling, and mine, unfortunately, was quite low." He said it like he was reading a medical diagnosis. My abilities were standard, not exceptional, no influential family, no special talent, So I did what I could with what I had. But eventually you realize you've hit your limit, so what's left? Transgression. His eyes sparkled as he looked at the creature. Using that chimera, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Seems like your talent isn't the only thing that's mediocre. He didn't flinch, not even a twitch. That was almost more repulsive than his earlier smile. Of course it doesn't give me power, nor would it raise my biological ceiling, he replied as if explaining a soup recipe. The creature wasn't designed for that. It's an offering. I said nothing, just watched him spiral deeper into his rotten logic. The Spellmans, they're cautious, careful, especially now that they've been declared criminals by the council. They don't accept new allies easily, even less so if that ally doesn't have a powerful family backing them or a dark reputation. His voice lowered. To them, I'm just an individual, and lone individuals can be traitors, council pawns, or simply a nuisance. But if I give them something that clearly shows my moral boundaries are on par with theirs, then they'll let me in. If he wants to join them, he must have some way of contacting the Spellmans, or someone who does, I thought, a new idea forming in my mind. Maybe this mission wasn't as pointless as it seemed. I could interrogate him. The chimera is the ticket, an abomination built from normies and 2 outcasts, multiple souls. I know the demons working with the Spellmans will love it. It'll be useful for them to devour. Enid pressed her lips together, visibly disgusted. I kept silent, but I felt the darkness in my scythe tighten in my palm, craving to sever that bald head from its shoulders. After finishing his pathetic speech, I saw him extend his hand. Carved into his skin was a symbol, and it began to glow. But to make it happen, I must eliminate the 2 of you first, he said, as the symbol on his palm began to burn faintly. The chimera opened its eyes, not 2, not 4, but at least 8, uneven, deformed, scattered across its body. Its spine arched, its limbs tensed, and with a slow, grotesque motion it rose. You take the monster, I told Enid quietly. I'll deal with the bald idiot. The bald man stepped back, raising his marked hand. A telekinetic field burst outward violently, trying to freeze me in place. I felt the pressure in the air, like the oxygen had thickened, but it was nothing I hadn't faced before. I've trained with Luke. His telekinesis, the last time we sparred, could lift over 15 tons. This guy's power was clearly much weaker. I slid around the flank. Darkness surged in my left palm, forming a dense cloud. I wrapped it around myself like a second skin, breaking through the pressure of his telekinetic grip. I closed the distance, and his desperation became obvious. He began hurling objects from the surroundings, rusted crates, metal pipes, wooden fragments. All deflected with a single slash of my dark scythe. Pathetic, I muttered without slowing down. Beside me, Enid's roar echoed off the basement walls. She and the creature were already locked in combat. The chimera charged with clumsy but brutal force, while Enid moved with wild agility, blocking with her forearms, striking with her heels, dodging with quick, precise movements. The sound of her claws tearing into the chimera's deformed flesh rang clear. My scythe collided with a telekinetic barrier, one that didn't last a second. It shredded like paper. The bald man fell backward, gasping, raising a bloodied hand to try to form another defense. Weak, I thought with disdain. He looked 3 times my age, and this was all he could do. Not even a full minute. If instead of whining about his lack of talent, his biological ceiling, and wasting time with cheap dark sorcery, he had trained and worked to improve, he might have been stronger. Still, before I could land a killing blow, especially before cutting off the arm he used to control the creature, he didn't surrender. The symbol on his palm glowed once again. This time, the light was unstable, flickering. And in an instant, through a dense black cloud, the chimera appeared right in front of me, shielding its pathetic master. I truly hadn't expected that. It wasn't telekinesis. It was rudimentary spatial distortion, something he likely learned from some dark grimoire. The chimera, now less than 2 meters away, opened its jaws, wide, uneven, lined with both human and animal teeth. And it lunged at me. There was no room, no time to retreat. All I could do was form a shield of darkness. But just as I began to shape it, the bald man raised his palm again. The symbol carved into his flesh burned like a hot coal. I felt the pull, like the air around me had collapsed. It wasn't a push, it was suction. An unnatural pressure, dragging at my limbs, as if space itself had decided to swallow my energy. My focus broke for a split second, and it was already too late. Then, just as I braced to feel the bite tear into my side, something slammed into me. Enid, partially transformed. She struck me from the flank and threw me several meters back. I rolled across the stone basement floor, shielding myself with darkness before crashing into a shelf. I got back on my feet immediately, just in time to see Enid take my place. The chimera's jaws clamped down viciously on her fully transformed left arm. Enid growled in obvious pain, but she didn't freeze. With her free arm, she raised her claws and slashed upward, straight at the beast's throat. Its deformed flesh tore like wet paper. A dark stream of blood splattered the walls and part of Enid's face. The chimera shrieked, a mix of voices, and then she kicked it with her right leg, straight into its stomach. The chimera's body flew through the air and crashed into a shelf. The old wood cracked and splintered. The monster hit the ground hard, wheezing. Before the bald man could do anything else, I sank into my shadow. The floor swallowed me, and a second later I emerged right beside him. Before he could raise his marked hand, my scythe was already in motion. The blade sliced through the air and cut off his arm at the elbow. The symbol stopped glowing. He screamed, a sharp, almost shrill sound. He turned toward me, his left arm. I cut that one off too. He collapsed to his knees before me. To make sure he didn't try anything, I extended my free hand, and tendrils of darkness slithered out, wrapping around his torso and neck, constricting him with precise force, leaving him breathing but completely immobilized. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Enid approach the chimera. She simply raised her claw and drove it into the creature's skull. One strike, more out of mercy than rage. Enid stepped back a few paces, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from her wounded arm, dark and thick, falling onto the basement floor in an irregular rhythm. Her claws retracted, her transformed arms began to shrink, the skin smoothed, the fur vanished. Within seconds, her arms returned to normal. I walked toward her without saying a word at first. The cultist was still trapped behind me, his arms severed, trembling, half laughing. But I didn't look at him. Not yet. "Are you okay?" I asked, my tone as flat as ever. Enid sat on the floor, leaning her back against one of the blood-stained walls. She looked down at her arm. The bite was on her tricep and part of her bicep, swollen, bruised, with uneven fang marks. "I'm fine," she murmured, but her voice was weaker. "My regeneration's working, but it's slow, way too slow." I looked at her more closely. Her pupils were dilated, her skin paler. "Poison," I said aloud, though it wasn't really a question, it was a deduction. And as if he had been waiting for his moment, the cultist spoke. "Of course," he panted. "A rather exquisite blend, I must say. Even a werewolf's regeneration would struggle with it, though sadly, it's not lethal." He burst out laughing. I didn't turn to face him. I just listened. Then I looked back at Enid. Her breathing was heavier, but she was still conscious. "You didn't have to do that," I finally said. "Save you from a bite that would have taken off your entire arm." She shot back, with a lopsided, tired but steady smile. Yeah, clearly I didn't have to. I didn't argue, because she was right. I had let my guard down. I had underestimated the bald one's pathetic telekinetic strength. Enid adjusted herself against the wall as best she could. Her breathing seemed to worsen with each passing minute. Her arm remained swollen, bruised. Her regeneration wasn't working. "Interrogate him," she said suddenly. Her voice was weaker, but still sharp. "We finally have one who didn't off himself the moment he lost." I nodded silently. I turned and walked toward the cultist. still bound by my shadow ropes. He writhed and trembled, his bloodied stumps twitching, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation, fanaticism, and a flicker of twisted dignity. "What was your method of contact?" I asked. My voice was firm, emotionless. "Who were you going to reach out to deliver the chimera?" The bald man smiled, teeth stained with blood. "You think I care about helping you?" he spat. "I already know I'm going to die. Why would I help you?" I looked into his eyes, searching for cracks. He wasn't going to give me anything. I could torture him, make him beg for a quick death, but that would take time I didn't have. I glanced over my shoulder. Enid had her eyes closed. Her chest was rising and falling with effort. She was losing consciousness. Her body was trying to hold on, but it wouldn't last much longer. I made a decision. A spear of shadow formed in my hand, and without a second of hesitation, I drove it through his chest. The cultist convulsed, coughed up blood, and died with his eyes open, confused. Clearly, he'd been expecting more conversation. I crouched down, took the dark sorcery book from one of his pockets, and stashed it away. Then I walked over to Enid. "Let's go. It's time to head back," I said. "Done interrogating him," Enid murmured. She was clearly not in her right mind. I hadn't expected the chimera's poison to destabilize her so quickly. "Yes, now get up. We need to get back so you can be treated," I replied, helping her to her feet. She opened her eyes slowly and stood up awkwardly. Her legs were shaking. "I don't need help," she muttered stubbornly. I raised an eyebrow at her. And when her leg gave out a second time, I picked her up, forced her onto my back. She growled softly in protest, more out of pride than actual will. Her body was far too weak to resist. "This isn't necessary," she mumbled. "Yes, it is," I said simply. And so, with her on my back, I began the return. The trip was clearly slower. Carrying a medium-sized werewolf isn't exactly comfortable. But it's not impossible either. 15 minutes, no more. It would really be nice to have Luke's abilities in moments like this. His telekinesis, the way he could lift me like I weighed nothing. And now, with his green aura amplifying it even further, I really miss him. No, what am I thinking? I shook my head. This isn't the time for that. It's strange, really, that I'm carrying Enid now, rushing to get her treated. A few months ago, I wouldn't have done this. Wednesday's POV. Journal entry, March 25. It's been 10 days since the mission involving the deranged cultist who created the chimera by kidnapping normies and 2 outcasts. The bite Enid suffered on her arm turned out to be more serious than I initially thought. She had a fever for 3 days and couldn't get out of bed. The chimera's poison was slow and persistent. According to Nevermore's head nurse, it interfered with regenerative processes. I skipped classes those days and took care of her, something I normally wouldn't do. The only person capable of pulling that out of me is Luke. I didn't do it out of obligation, maybe partly out of guilt. It was my fault she got hurt. I got overconfident, underestimated the situation. But I also did it because I wanted to, deep down. And in these cases, I know how to distinguish between impulse and will. Larissa granted me permission without too many questions. She knows about our missions. She's a reliable ally, more intellectual than combative. During those days, I brought Enid's fever down with cold cloths. I changed the bandages on her wounded arm. I watched over her while she slept. I served her tea, though she barely sipped it. I kept my video calls with Luke. I just changed the setting. I sat on a chair next to Enid's bed. He didn't see her. He spoke in his usual confident tone, telling me how his training was going, how many hits he managed to land on my uncle, on Stalin, or on my father. How he's training Naira the Wendigo we somehow adopted. I listened carefully and replied, but I also kept a discreet eye on Enid as she rested. Every time she heard Luke's voice, she reacted, and I'm certain she was paying close attention. Her eyes remained closed, but her face relaxed. The rhythm of her chest became more even. It bothered me a little, I must say, but not as much as it would have in the past, when I might have wanted to stab her. This was a different kind of discomfort. Not jealousy. I already know Luke is mine, and he doesn't have eyes for anyone else. Even Enid has kept her word, and never acted like she wanted to get close to Luke, or murder me to get me out of the way, or anything of the sort. And that, coming from someone with lethal claws and a latent obsession, deserves a certain level of respect. She's had plenty of situations where I entrusted her with my back. The mission with the Chimera could have ended with that beast tearing my arm off, just to give one example. I realize that, when it comes to Enid, I don't mind so much sharing moments with Luke. Letting her enjoy his voice, letting her calm down when she hears him. She doesn't feel like a threat. After her fever broke, Enid had to rest for a full day, and I stayed by her side then too. In the days that followed, we had no missions, and almost unbelievably, our relationship improved. It's strange how something can be rebuilt without you even noticing. Journal entry, May 22. 1 week left until the school year ends. I'll finally be able to go home and see Luke. The missions resumed after the incident in Eltonin Village. We had a short break thanks to the fever and venom affecting Enid more than expected, but that's all it was, a break, not an end. The war has escalated on multiple fronts since then. More nighttime skirmishes, more lunatics performing dark rituals in remote towns, vampires hunting normies for blood like in the old days, cultists roaming free like never before. Since that moment, Enid and I didn't just become a tactical team again. Our friendship fully healed. I suppose when you go through so many life-or-death situations together, literally entrust each other with your backs, share a dorm, patch up wounds and awkward silences, what was broken gets rebuilt. Without asking, without announcing it. It simply returns. More than that, it's better now than our brief friendship back when I first arrived at Nevermore. But there's something I can't get out of my head. A detail that planted its seed in me sometime in April and has been quietly growing ever since. I've started researching werewolves, not as an academic project, but for personal reasons. I'm not sure what led me to do it. Maybe an offhand comment, a look on her face when I mentioned Luke, or perhaps the way her mood shifts whenever she hears him speak. Werewolf culture is intense, traditional, proud. And at the center of it all lies the concept of the mate, the fated partner. A bond that, once formed, is almost impossible to truly break. The texts are clear. It's not always the first boyfriend, not always the first relationship, but when a werewolf falls in love, truly, with instinct, with soul, with body, that person becomes their mate. And that bond doesn't dissolve with time, or rejection, or distance. From the way Enid acts around Luke, how she wants to protect him at all costs, it's obvious to assume he's her mate. He was her first real love, her first total surrender. And even though he's not a werewolf, and the bond isn't biologically mutual, Enid was marked. She can pretend to be distant. She can say she no longer chases him. But I see the cracks. It's not just obsession, it's something else. Something that could become dangerous, not for me or for Luke. For her. How does someone survive knowing the person they marked as their life partner didn't choose them? How long can someone as emotional as Enid live with that emptiness, that wound? I feel like I'm watching someone walk the edge of a cliff, not out of betrayal, not out of revenge, but because maybe everything else in her life just isn't enough. And me. I don't know why I care so much. Well, maybe I do, because I consider her my friend. And that, for me, means a lot. In my entire 16 years of life, Enid is the only one I could truly call a friend. It's a strange relationship. It's not like what I have with Luke. It's not love, it's not desire. With him, there's a passion that consumes me, a connection that's intellectual, psychic, strategic, brutal, and romantic. He is my equal, my other distorted reflection. With Enid, it's different. It's a trust rooted in camaraderie between girls, something I'll never have with Luke. Conversations with a friend, like the ones Luke probably has with Xavier and Ajax. Jokes I don't understand. Junk food I'd never willingly put in my mouth. And maybe that's why I keep thinking about the inevitable, about what's going to happen once this war is over. Enid will drift away. She said it herself. She'll help Luke as long as the conflict lasts, without crossing paths with him more than necessary. And when the war ends, she'll leave and let us be. Because no one can live their entire life beside the person who won the heart of their soulmate. I know that. And I know she does too. That's why, these past few days, she stopped listening in on Luke's video calls. She no longer pretends to be asleep while I talk to him. She no longer smiles when his voice comes through. It's as if she's distancing herself, to protect herself, to start preparing for what's coming. And that distance, just the thought of her pulling away in the future, hurt more than I expected. That's why the idea, the one I'm still not ready to say out loud, has become more persistent. Not just to keep her from falling off the edge, but because I don't want to lose a connection I know I'll never be able to recreate. Journal entry, May 29. In 2 days, school ends and I'll return home. I've made a decision. One I never thought would cross my mind. One that, a year ago, I would have considered absurd, uncomfortable, unthinkable. But now it feels logical, or rather necessary. I'm going to propose a polyamorous relationship. Not out of a desire to experiment or on a whim. I'm doing it because I don't want to lose Enid. I don't want her to vanish from my life the moment the war ends. I don't want this friendship we've rebuilt to dissolve as if it never existed. I want her in my life as a friend and companion. As a presence that balances my darkness with her light, though now, that light is dimmer and more cynical than it used to be. And I know she still loves Luke. He's her mate, an instinctive chemical bond. Difficult, if not impossible, to break for a werewolf in love, especially one like Enid, so emotional and loyal. Luke isn't a werewolf. He doesn't feel that bond, but he did love her once. Now he loves me. But what if he could love us both? Not as an object, of course. Even though, for the average guy, having his girlfriend suggest something like this, with his ex, might sound like a fantasy. 2 girls who love him. 2 girls willing to fight and die for him. Luke should be grateful. Many would kill just to be with one of us. Polyamory isn't foreign to the outcast world. Especially in older generations, it was more common, sometimes for inheritance, for reproduction, for strategy. In my case, it would be for something far rarer, genuine affection. A romantic and obsessive love for Luke. And a deep friendship for Enid. My parents are monogamous, the epitome of eternal, exclusive love. 2 lunatics bound in a marriage that looks like a Gothic stage play. I grew up watching that. I saw how one person could be enough for another, and because of that, I believed I'd never be able to share Luke. That I'd never even consider the possibility. But who says I want to be like them? Repeat their patterns? Fit into their mold? No. I'm not my mother. First, I'll talk to Enid. I'll propose it and see what she chooses, though I'm sure she'll say yes. If I'm willing to do this, because I consider her an important friend, then I'm certain she'll be willing too. The hardest part will be talking to Luke and getting him to agree. Because even if any other guy would be thrilled by the idea, I know Luke isn't just any guy. Any other teenager his age would probably faint from joy if his girlfriend said, "How would you feel about having 2?" But Luke wouldn't. I know him. I know the idea might sound appealing, in theory. But I also know he'd immediately understand what it actually means in practice. Being the emotional center of 2 people who love him. And while that might sound romantic, it's a hell of a responsibility. Luke, being who he is, can be many things. Strong, brilliant, loyal. But emotionally lazy. He wants peace, balance, room to train, to play video games, to think, to wander. Having to manage two romantic bonds, even if those bonds get along, would be, for him, draining. I know because I wouldn't be able to handle it if the roles were reversed. Let's consider the impossible scenario. Suppose that, through some cursed crack in the multiverse, I fell in love with another boy besides Luke. Someone as compatible with me as he is, which is impossible, but let's pretend. Having to split my time, my attention, my emotional energy between two people who love me, who need me, who expect things from me. Utterly exhausting. Just thinking about it gives me a headache. I'd probably end up trying to kill one of them if they became too annoying. But Luke isn't me. He doesn't have my level of neurosis, or my ability to plan efficient murders in enclosed spaces. He is lazy. He does hate unnecessary drama. Complications irritate him, and deep down, he has a dangerously strong tendency to crave emotional peace. A tendency that constantly clashes with the lives we lead. But he's also him. And if there's anyone capable of navigating something like this, it's Luke. He already loved Enid once, which makes things easier. And then he loved me, even more deeply. And if I explain the whole mate thing, how werewolves become emotionally and biologically bound to their first love. The real danger lies in letting that connection collapse. Enid's potential depression, her slow deterioration. With a bit of manipulation, tactical, necessary, merciful, maybe that's how he'll understand and accept it. And if none of that works, I still have one last card up my sleeve. Myself. My most unusual expression, vulnerability. I could tell him I don't want to lose Enid, that she was my first real friend. And that once this war ends, she'll walk away. I know it's a low move, even for me. But even Luke, with all his emotional apathy, couldn't ignore that. Not when it comes to my pain. Besides, few things are more alluring than having the unconditional love of two girls as different as we are. I finished writing those last lines when a soft laugh broke my thoughts. I recognized it instantly. Joyful, though perhaps calmer than before. Enid. The door opened before I could hide the page. She walked in with a smile and her usual spark of energy. "Wednesday, you won't believe what Thing did today," she said, laughing, while my family's hand rode comfortably on her shoulder. Thing gave me a salute with his fingers in military fashion, and I stood still for a second, watching them. An Adam's hand, heirloom of generations, showing affection to someone who doesn't share our blood, who doesn't carry our name, who doesn't even dwell in our darkness. It's time, I thought, as I tucked the page away and rose to my feet. Thanks for watching this episode. Like, share, and follow for more interesting stories and narrations. Thanks a lot.